Chapter 1008. Inside this light, even Luo Fan and Wu Daozi felt their eyes sting. They couldn't tell what was happening inside the light. They didn't know how long this lasted. Perhaps it was an instant, or perhaps it was several hours. When the light dissipated, an old man was floating in the sky with a blank look in his eyes. Wu Daozi's reaction was extremely fast. When he saw the old man, he casually waved his hand and the old man appeared on the Qilin cliff. The old man's eyes were blank, as if he was the fastest to react to the changes in the outside world. Luo Fan looked at this situation and couldn't help but sigh. It seemed like this was also the case when he came out. He thought that as soon as he came out, he was standing on the Qilin cliff. As soon as he came out, he saw a world that was completely different from the Earth in the Age of Chaos. However, in reality, there was a period of time that was completely blank in his memory. In this period of time, he even lost the ability to resist and could only let the other party do whatever he wanted. If Wu Daozi had been ruthless back then, perhaps he would have died and his soul scattered for an unknown period of time. Wu Daozi's expression was calm and indifferent. It was as if he didn't care at all. As for the change in Luo Fan's expression, it was as if he didn't care at all. Luo Fan looked at his expression and knew that Wu Daozi was purposely treating this new cultivator like this in front of him. It was to let him see how miserable he was back then and let him know how easy it was to kill him back then. Looks like he is still dissatisfied. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and the emotion that had just emerged from the bottom of his heart dissipated a lot. No matter what, he was very clear now. At that dangerous moment, no matter how miserable he was back then or how powerless he was, it didn't affect him at all. After a while, the new old man's body shook and the blankness in his eyes disappeared. He blinked his eyes and looked around. There was an indescribable shock in his eyes. Where is this? Just now, I barged into that era vortex and confused the era. What era is this? The old man muttered. Here. This was before heaven and earth had shattered. It is the world before all eras began, Wu Daozi said. His voice was extremely calm and clear, and it was directly sent into the old man's ears. When the old man heard this voice, he turned his head to look. He finally saw Luo Fan and Wu Daozi. He shivered. His eyes were filled with shock. Who the hell are you? What kind of place is this? The old man shouted. This old man was a great perfection quasi-sage. However, it was only equivalent to a great perfection quasi-saint who had transcended the great perfection. In fact, it was not even great perfection. Compared to Luo Fan, he was many times worse. It could even be said that if Luo Fan wanted to, he could easily crush him into powder with a single finger. Though Luo Fan's strength was shocking, his cultivation realm was not as good as Wu Daozi's. If it was like this for Luo Fan, then it was even more so for Wu Daozi. At that moment Wu Daozi smiled. He raised his hand and pinched the air as if he was picking up an ant. Just then, the old man suddenly felt his body become sluggish. He could no longer feel the vast power he originally controlled. Even his originally stable cultivation realm seemed to show signs of instability because of this pinch. Suddenly having such a thought, the old man suddenly felt that it was difficult for him to even breathe. His eyes were filled with shock. Hee, it seems that he has learned his lesson. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled slightly, and such a thought flashed in his mind. If it was the Luo Fan of the past, Wu Daozi wouldn't have been able to do it as easily as he did with this old man. However, the current Luo Fan wouldn't have been able to do it with such ease. The reason why Wu Daozi was doing this was because he had learned his lesson when he let Luo Fan go. It was because he let Luo Fan go that the Qilin Cliff suffered 100 years of misfortune. It almost destroyed billions of years of hard work. Therefore, when he saw a newcomer, he didn't want to treat Luo Fan the same way he treated him. Instead, he wanted to teach him a lesson so that he would be more obedient. It was a long time. Only then did Wu Daozi let go. The old man took in a deep breath. His body trembled for a while before he returned to normal. However, when he looked at Wu Daozi, he didn't dare to be as presumptuous as before. There was some fear in his eyes. This is the Qilin Cliff. You have passed through the path before, so I believe you have a good understanding of the development of the era. If you sense it carefully, you will know what time it is. Wu Daozi said. The old man frowned and closed his eyes to sense the world. After a while, he let out a long sigh and said, "So that's how it is. This place is indeed before the era began. The reincarnation restriction of the world has disappeared without a trace." After sighing, an indescribable joy appeared in the depths of his eyes. It was as if he had found what he had been dreaming of. "My name is Wu Daozi. I am the disciple of the saint, the ancestor of all monsters. May I know how to address you?" Seeing the old man walk over, Wu Daozi smiled and said. If he had said all this before, the old man would have disdained him and thought he was bragging. He wouldn't believe that he was the disciple of the saint. But after the encounter just now, he felt the power that made him feel hopeless. How could this old man dare to doubt Wu Daozi's words? He quickly bowed and said, "So you are the disciple of the saint. I am Taoist priest. Greetings, senior." Wu Daozi's strength was many times stronger than the old man's. To the old man, he was a senior. At least, according to the old man's culture, he was a senior. Luo Fan stood there and looked at the old man with sympathy in his eyes. It looks like this person is completely suppressed by the name of the saint and doesn't dare to have any other thoughts. This thought flashed through his mind, and the sympathy in his eyes when he looked at the old man became even stronger. However, Luo Fan's thought was a little presumptuous. Not every cultivator respected the sage as much as he did, and even suspected that the sage was scheming against them. To the cultivators of the Earth universe, the saint was a supreme and omnipotent existence. Since this kind of existence was omnipotent, why would they need to use cultivators who hadn't become saints? Under such circumstances, any arrangements made by the sage would only be a fortuitous encounter for them. Not being able to do anything was a disaster. Thus, normal cultivators, after passing through the path that brought them countless benefits, might have some doubts and fear. They might think that the person behind it had ulterior motive. They were scheming against them. But once they found out that this path was related to the saint, of course they would get rid of this doubt. They would no longer think that the setting of this path would have any negative impact on them. All that existed in their hearts was gratitude. This had nothing to do with their stupidity. It was only about their thoughts. In comparison, people like Luo Fan were different. Seeing the patriarch Daoist's reaction, Wu Daozi couldn't help but smile. He said, "You should work hard on cultivating on the Qilin Cliff. I believe that you should have gained a lot from passing through that path. Cultivating on this Qilin Cliff will definitely allow you to make a big breakthrough in your cultivation." Wu Daozi hadn't gone through the path of transcendence before. The conclusion he made was completely deduced from Luo Fan. Luo Fan's performance was too obvious. After coming out of that path, it had only been a short period of more than 200 years, but he had already made unimaginable progress. He was even on par with the peak of the sage-to-be. Although he had almost destroyed the Qilin Cliff, in his opinion, if Luo Fan had not obtained any benefits from that path, he would not have been able to see it. Hearing Wu Daozi's words, the patriarch Daozi couldn't help but be overjoyed. He said, "Thank you for your mercy, senior." Saying that, he bowed to the patriarch Daozi before carefully going to a place with the worst environment in the Qilin Cliff to open up a cave abode. Any place, even if it was a holy land for cultivation like Qilin Cliff, would not have a completely balanced environment. Some places would be better than others, and some would be worse than others. Even if it was worse, it would still be unimaginably better than the places outside the Holy Land, but it would still be worse than other places. Looking at the old man's cave, Wu Daozi was very pleased. He felt that Ziji's previous actions were too wise. This ancestral patriarch Taoist was indeed not like Luo Fan, who gave him a headache. Luo Fan looked at the patriarch Daozi's appearance and couldn't help but sigh. During the conversation between Wu Daozi and the patriarch Daozi had taken a few glances at Luo Fan. However, after Wu Daozi said that Luo Fan was a sage's disciple, the patriarch Daozi directly threw Luo Fan aside and only had eyes for Wu Daozi. Even when he left to open up a cave abode, he didn't care about Luo Fan at all. He didn't even bother to get to know Luo Fan. Now, there were so many wonderful environments for him to choose from, for him to cultivate in, but he chose the worst Weiji out of all of them. This was a deep sense of servility. How could he not sigh? Of course, the patriarch Daozi was a great completion quasi-sage who had passed 9,999 checkpoints on the transcendence path. It might be too much to say that he was servile, but no matter what, this was not how a true cultivator should behave. Naturally, Luo Fan couldn't stand it. What a pity! Luo Fan sighed. What a pity! If you are like him, the benefits you will obtain in the future will be unimaginable. Wu Daozi looked at Luo Fan and said faintly, "Haha, benefits? Cultivation depends on the body. Only the body that cultivates the body is the body that cultivates the body. Benefits given by others, no matter what, belong to them." Luo Fan looked at Wu Daozi and laughed. Wu Daozi frowned, but he didn't say anything. Luo Fan looked at Wu Daozi and said, "I don't know what you're planning by setting up so many time vortexes in the future, but I'm sure that if you want to rely on this plan to become a sage, it's definitely not going to work. There is no other reason. It is because all of this is the plan of the Thousand Demons' ancestor. What you will obtain in the end is just a gift from the Thousand Demons' ancestor." Wu Daozi's expression changed slightly, but he still said something. "Why don't you think about it? How many billions of years have passed since the world was created, and how many billions of years have passed with the help of the sages? If the sages could bestow Ningo to people to become sages, how could there only be 7 sages in this world? I don't believe that the 7 sages didn't think about nurturing more sages in these billions of years." Luo Fan laughed. These words caused Wu Daozi's expression to change drastically. His aura was no longer concealed. It rushed out of his body in an unimaginable manner. It pressed down on Luo Fan. Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. The aura in his body was unleashed without holding back. It directly went up against Wu Daozi's aura. Wu Daozi was a pinnacle quasi-sage, or even the pinnacle of the pinnacle quasi-sage. His aura was so strong. It had already reached an unimaginable level. The aura that was emitted from his body. They condensed into countless lifelike strange beasts in the void. Every single one of these strange beasts was extremely strong and agile. It was as if they were real living beings. The moment they appeared, they charged towards Luo Fan crazily. They even displayed all sorts of techniques in the void. A flash of light and heaven and earth were destroyed. The hundreds of miles around Luo Fan's body seemed to have turned into chaos. Even space and time seemed to have become chaotic because of the techniques of these strange beasts. Luo Fan had already reached the peak of the transcendent realm. The power of his techniques could even be compared to a pinnacle quasi-sage. In addition, he cultivated the Tao fruit Tao that he created based on his own insight. The techniques that he displayed had reached the limit of his cultivation realm. Thus, although the aura that he emitted was not as terrifying as Wu Daozi's aura, it was not much different in terms of profoundness. After it was emitted, it directly condensed into countless strange-shaped three-dimensional talismans in the void. They were like countless magic treasures. Every single talisman charged towards a strange beast. Similarly, they exploded with all sorts of powers and started to fight against those strange beasts. Although Wu Daozi was currently at his peak, he still remembered his master's instructions. Or rather, he still believed in his master's plan. He did not intend to kill Luo Fan but merely wanted to teach him a lesson. Thus, he used his own aura to suppress Luo Fan. Wu Daozi stood at his original position with his hands behind his back. He then followed the aura and started to fight against Luo Fan. That Chuan Zong Daozi had originally moved to the worst cultivation ground in the Qilin Cliff in preparation to open his own cave. At this moment, he suddenly sensed the undulations at the edge of the Qilin Cliff. He could not help but be shocked and carefully extended his perception over. When he sensed what was happening, he could not help but be shocked. He could not help but feel a surge of regret. He secretly regretted being so impolite to Luo Fan. This person is actually so powerful. Just his aura alone is probably enough to destroy my body and soul. I treated him like that before. If he was dissatisfied and slightly suppressed his aura, wouldn't I be finished? Thinking of this, the Chuan Zong Daozi became even more regretful. The Chuan Zong Daozi lived in a completely different future than the future that Luo Fan lived in. According to his calculations, the era he lived in was before the Age of Chaos. However, that era did not exist in the many eras before the Age of Chaos. It was an era of saint cultivators. In this era, the Chuan Zong Daozi was only an intermediate quasi-sage. He was not the strongest expert of that era. During that era, there were a few supreme great perfection quasi-sages that suppressed the universe, forcing all cultivators and living beings to submit to them. The reason why he entered the era vortex was that he had offended a great perfection quasi-saint of that era. He was chased by the quasi-saint until he had nowhere to go, and he had no choice but to enter the forbidden area. At that time, there were hundreds of cultivators who followed him. The weakest among them was a primordial pure yang cultivator, while the strongest was a quasi-sage in the great perfection realm. However, such a powerful force could not unite in the 9,999 levels, because everyone had their own agendas. As a result, they were constantly depleted. In the end, there were less than 10 cultivators left in the 9 dream realms. After that, he was lucky enough to survive the many dangers in the 9 dreamlands and became the last survivor. With the help of others' sacrifice, he passed the 9,999 levels and raised his cultivation realm to the great perfection realm of quasi-sage. He passed the test of this path and came to the Qilin Cliff before the beginning of this era. Because of this experience, he did not have the mentality of a true peak expert and his fighting will was not very firm. Now that he saw how powerful Luo Fan was, he did not want to have a fight with him to achieve a breakthrough. Instead, he wanted to admit defeat and submit. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, and the Chuan Zong Daoist finally made a decision. If Luo Fan Ningguo survived, he would certainly curry favor with him. Even if he couldn't let Luo Fan Ningguo treat him as his best friend, he would certainly dispel his dissatisfaction towards Luo Fan Ningguo. If Luo Fan Ningguo could obtain some benefits from Luo Fan Ningguo, it would certainly be better. After making his decision, the Chuan Zong Daozi smiled and stopped paying attention to the changes at the edge. He withdrew his perception and continued to open up his cave abode. Chapter 1009. Luo Fan's aura condensed into countless 3D talismans. Every 3D talisman had various mysterious uses. They were no weaker than the beasts that Wu Daozi's aura condensed into. The various techniques he used were all extremely mysterious. Every time they exchanged attacks, they would annihilate each other, turning this space and time into chaos. Before this world broke and became the Earth universe, the stability of space and time was even stronger than the primitive world. Compared to the Earth universe during the Age of Chaos, it was tens of thousands of times stronger. Moreover, it also had the mysterious characteristic of the primitive world that could not be broken if one's cultivation level was not high enough. However, this characteristic clearly had its limit. Luo Fan and Wu Daozi's cultivation realm was already close to the peak below the Saint realm. They had long surpassed the limits of this special space. With just a slight movement of their auras, they would naturally be able to cause shocking destruction, creating a chaotic state similar to primal chaos. The anger in Wu Daozi's heart gradually calmed down as time went on. After all, his will was incomparably firm. Luo Fan's previous verbal attack had made him angry out of humiliation, but after he had sobered up, he had already found many flaws in it. Perhaps it was the flaws that he thought. He refocused and his confidence stabilized. Therefore, his aura suddenly exploded. All of the mystical beasts turned into a strange creature that seemed to contain all the characteristics of mystical beasts, and seemed to transcend all mystical beasts. It directly rushed towards Luo Fan in a manner that pervaded the world, wanting to completely crush the aura that Luo Fan was emitting. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that Wu Daozi was no longer angry. At this moment, he no longer had the thought of making Luo Fan suffer. This aura attack was his last attack. If he could not dodge it, then everything would be over. If he could dodge it, then he would not bother him anymore. With this thought, he controlled his own aura and directly constructed a huge, mirror-like 3D talisman in front of Wu Daozi's aura. This 3D talisman was like a huge mirror. It directly blocked in front of the huge beast. Behind the mirror, like a real mirror, appeared a wondrous beast of the same size and appearance. There was even no difference in strength between it and the wondrous beast. It smashed into the mirror with the same posture. There was a loud rumble. The entire Qilin cliff shook violently at this moment. It was as if it could not withstand the impact, and was about to break into pieces and turn into dust. At the same time, an invisible shockwave exploded from the point of contact between the mirror and the strange beast. It swept in all directions and covered millions of miles of the void. The ancestral Taoist's cave abode was also within the range of the shockwave, and the cave abode he created collapsed. All of his efforts were for naught. Of course, this was also because he had only just begun to move, and the cave abode was not fully formed yet. It was only a prototype. If he had completed the construction of this cave abode, although this impact would have caused some damage to his cave abode, it definitely wouldn't have caused the entire cave abode to collapse and disappear like this. After the shockwave passed, everything returned to normal. Whether it was the mirror formed by Luo Fan's aura or the shocking beast formed by Wu Daozi's aura, or even the chaos caused by the battle of auras, they all disappeared without a trace. The heaven and earth became clear again as if nothing had happened. Only Luo Fan and Wu Daozi stood opposite each other. What the saint did, what you can understand. For you to comment on the journey of a saint, you are just a frog in a well looking at the sky, a summer bug talking about ice. Wu Daozi snorted. He turned around, sat down cross-legged, and quietly observed the 100 million time vortexes in front of him. He no longer cared about Luo Fan. Luo Fan saw this. He smiled and said, "What is the truth? You will know in the future." Although the words he said to Wu Daozi were his own thoughts, the reason he said it was only to attack Wu Daozi. Whether Wu Daozi truly believed him or not was meaningless to him. Since Wu Daozi had already been attacked once, he was too lazy to dwell on this issue. Even though he believed that his way of thinking was not wrong and that Wu Daozi was walking on a fork in the road, he did not have the mood to care. Moreover, if he really used these words to convince Wu Daozi, he would instead regret saying them. Luo Fan didn't go to Wu Daozi's side like before. Instead, he sat down and watched the time whirlpools. Due to the appearance of the ancestral patriarch, he had seen the entire process clearly. Even if there were some parts that he could not understand, it was not something that could be solved by watching more. Therefore, it was meaningless for him to continue watching here. Therefore, why would he continue to stay there? In a few steps, he arrived at the most beautiful place in the Qilin cliff. At this time, because of Luo Fan's previous actions, the entire Qilin cliff had undergone a subtle change. Therefore, the place with the best cultivation environment had also slightly shifted. Therefore, he couldn't return to the place where he had stayed for more than 200 years. This place was quite far from where the ancestral Taoist was. Even though it wasn't as far as crossing the Qilin cliff, it was still half the distance. After Luo Fan came here, he casually threw the three-dimensional talisman ball in his hand. The countless three-dimensional talismans directly constructed an 11-layer, palace-shaped three-dimensional talisman. It fell directly on the ground. This 3D seal took root. After coming into contact with the ground, it completely fused with the ground. It looked like a palace had grown out of the Qilin cliff. Seeing this, Luo Fan suddenly had an idea. He lifted his hand and brushed the air above the main entrance of the palace. In an instant, 3 large words that any living being, regardless of whether they were literate or not, would be able to understand the meaning of these words with a single glance. They were Last Days Hall. From the perspective of the Earth's universe, he came from the end of days, although he didn't feel that this was anything to be proud of. Although he didn't think this was anything to be proud of, since more and more cultivators would walk the path of transcendence from the whirlpool of time and arrive here, there had to be a name to distinguish his place of residence from other cultivators. Calling it the Last Days Hall was the most appropriate. After the name was fixed, Luo Fan smiled and stepped into the Last Days Hall. Although the Last Days Palace's 3D talisman was 2 levels higher than when he had first constructed it, it looked more ordinary than before. At least, it didn't have the characteristic of absorbing the vitality of the outside world for its own use. In other words, it didn't have the characteristic of absorbing the vitality of the outside world for its own use. The entire Last Days Hall stood there like an ordinary palace. The Qilin cliff was very magical. After the Last Days Hall was completely stabilized, the surrounding vegetation grew naturally. In the end, the surroundings of the Last Days Hall were no different from other places. It was as if the Last Days Hall had existed here for hundreds of millions of years, as if it had always been here since ancient times. It looked very mysterious. The Last Days Palace was actually a 3-dimensional talisman with 11 layers. Everything inside it would naturally change according to Luo Fan's will. However, the interior of the palace was not like the ordinary palace. It was not just a palace. With just a thought, Luo Fan moved his mind. The inside of the palace turned into a boundless void. It was a void without any sun, moon, or stars. Then, he stood in the middle of the void and raised his hand to touch his surroundings. The void changed several feet away from him. It evolved into the Qilin cliff. Then, the Qilin cliff quickly shrank. In the blink of an eye, it became smaller than his body. At first glance, it seemed as if he was the Qilin cliff, and the Qilin cliff was him. The scenery around him also changed at the same time. A boundless sea of clouds appeared in the void, completely covering the entire void. As Luo Fan stood there, it seemed as if he was standing in the sea of clouds. This sea of clouds, it was the sea of clouds outside the Qilin cliff. What Luo Fan was doing now was using his own senses, or in other words, the wonderful effect of the 3D seal to reconstruct the scenery of the outside world inside the 3D seal. In other words, he was using the 3D seal to transmit the light and shadow of the outside world. This allowed Luo Fan to perceive all kinds of things in the outside world as if he was there. Above the boundless sea of clouds, there were 10 suns hanging high in the sky. The suns were fiercely hot, emitting endless sun essence and sun fire, bringing endless light and heat to the universe. They brought endless vitality. Luo Fan looked down and saw all kinds of things under the sea of clouds. It was a boundless world. The vastness of the world. Although it was smaller than the universe of the future Earth, it could only be measured in hundreds of millions of light years. The first thing that entered Luo Fan's eyes was a boundless ocean. Above this ocean, there were endless continents. Among these continents, there were even more islands. However, among these countless continents, there were 4 continents that were many times larger than the other island. In fact, it was impossible to describe their size with specific measurement. If one had to describe them, they could only be described as boundless. They were obviously the 4 continents before the world shattered and became the Earth universe. Just as Luo Fan focused his attention on these 4 continents, 4 names appeared in his mind out of thin air. Dongxing Divine Continent, Aparagodania Continent, Nanzhan Continent, Beilu Continent. These 4 names were directly transmitted to him based on the images of the 4 continents. It was not his imagination, nor was it someone who told him the names of the 4 continents. Instead, it was natural for him to know the names of the 4 continents. The beauty of this was similar to the 3 words, Last Day's Palace, that he had engraved on the entrance of the 11-layered 3-dimensional seal. The words Last Day's Palace possessed a similar effect. Any living being, regardless of whether they could read or not, regardless of whether they had intelligence or not, regardless of whether they knew this language or not, so long as they saw these words, they would know that it was Last Day's Palace, and they wouldn't have any difficulties in understanding it. Similarly, these 4 names were the same. One did not need to know the names of these 4 continents. As long as one saw these 4 continents, one would naturally know what they were called. One would naturally understand that the Dongxing Divine Continent, Aparagodania Continent, Nanzhan Continent, and Beilu Continent were the names of these 4 continents. I did not expect the legends to be true. There are actually 4 continents like these. After being together for hundreds of trillions of years, after experiencing countless reincarnations of eras, the legends on Earth are actually completely consistent with the world before the world was destroyed. There isn't even a single word of error. Nothing is more wonderful than this. Luo Fan couldn't help but secretly sigh. Luo Fan couldn't be more familiar with these 4 names. In his previous life, when he was still on Earth, as a mortal, he already knew these 4 names. At that time, he knew these 4 names from a novel written by a mortal. There were even countless legends that had happened on the 4 continents. They were vivid and lifelike, making people feel as if they were there. 4 names that would be fantasized about by novelists billions of years in the future had actually existed billions of years ago. There was not the slightest error. The profoundness of it made him sigh with emotion at the wonders of the world. Perhaps it's because these 4 continents have such wonders that these 4 names have been passed down from generation to generation. In the end, not even the reincarnation of the ages can be broken. In the end, Luo Fan could only come up with a somewhat far-fetched explanation as to why these 4 names would appear in the future. However, no matter how he thought about it, it seemed that only this somewhat far-fetched explanation could make sense. The fact that these 4 continents could let people know their names as soon as they saw them was obviously not a man-made mystery. In other words, it could not be a mystery added by the creatures after the birth of this world. No saint would be so bored as to refine these 4 continents with such a wonderful effect. The most likely reason for this mystery was that the Creator, who created this world, had added it to this world, or to these 4 continents. To him, it was obviously just a matter of a thought. Just like the primordial spirit of Pangu in the primitive world, it was to let all living beings understand who created this world. It was just that the Creator, who created this world, had done more. And such a mystery was engraved in the world. In other words, these 4 names should also be engraved in the world. Under such circumstances, whether the world was destroyed or not, no matter how much time had passed, no matter how many reincarnations of the ages, as long as the world existed, these 4 names should also exist in this world. And in the future, who knew how many trillions of years later, a certain novelist might have done it by chance, or perhaps he had a feeling. Perhaps his thoughts were secretly in line. In short, these 4 names were taken out of the world, incorporated into the novel, and spread from then on. The more Luo Fan thought about it, the more he felt that this explanation seemed to make sense. Of course. This was just his habit of instinctively wanting to explain everything. All kinds of thoughts just flashed through his mind. In the blink of an eye, they were thrown to the back of his mind. No matter how these names were passed down to future generations, in the end, it only made him more familiar with these names. With a thought, Luo Fan began to shift his attention to the four continents. The function of this three-dimensional talisman was limited, or it could be said that Luo Fan's perception ability had its limit. His perception of the four continents and the four continents did not really reach a very precise level. He could only roughly get some general terrain, some wonderful natural scenery in some places, and some auras of some powerful cultivators in some places. Of course, even so, it was already a great benefit for him, allowing him to obtain a great harvest. After a few days, he had a general understanding of the situation before the world was broken, whether it was the situation of the cultivation world or the various things in the human world. I didn't expect it to be so similar to the Dharma ending age. After understanding all kinds of things, Luo Fan could not help but secretly hesitate. The cultivation system of this world, before it was broken into the Earth universe, was surprisingly similar to the Dharma ending age. The mainstream was also the cultivation of the way of Jindan. Of course, because of the wonderful cultivation environment of this world, the cultivators were naturally congenital Jindan, but not acquired Jindan like the later Dharma ending age. Sensing the cultivation system of this heaven and earth, Luo Fan suddenly felt as if the time difference between this heaven and earth and the Dharma ending era, which was unknown how many billions of years had passed, didn't seem to exist at all. The cultivation world was constantly developing and changing. Even if the way of Jindan was the mainstream and orthodox in this Earth universe, there would always be changes in the long years of development. The essence might not change, but the form of expression would certainly change over time. It was like the computer software of later generations. The essence was still the same, but a few years later, compared to a few years ago, there would certainly be great changes, and there might even be no similarities at all. This cultivation system might not change so quickly, but after all, it was unknown how many billions of years it had been. If it developed normally, even if there was only a little change in hundreds of millions of years, it would eventually become unrecognizable. At this moment, Luo Fan found that whether it was the essence or the form of expression, there was no change. This absolutely violated the law of the development of things. How could he not feel unacceptable? After thinking for a while, Luo Fan finally reacted, and a wry smile appeared on his face. Chapter 10:10. Luo Fan saw the changes in the entire world. His understanding of the world that had yet to shatter and become a globe became deeper and deeper. This understanding didn't allow him to make any unbelievable progress in his cultivation, but it allowed him to have a more direct understanding of the river of time and the abilities of the sages. Two eras that had been together for who knows how many trillions of years, one before the world shattered and the other after who knows how many trillions of years, the cultivation systems between the two were actually so similar. They were practically the same. How unbelievable was this? How unimaginable was this? There was only one reason for this, and that was the existence of the sages as well. How unbelievable was this power? How powerful were the sages to be able to do this? One could imagine all of this. The four continents were vast and boundless, and there were countless living beings on each of them. The number of these living beings was endless. It wasn't even enough to describe it with trillions. And among these countless living beings, the number of cultivators was extremely huge. At least, compared to the ratio of normal living beings to cultivators during the end of the world, it was tens of thousands of times larger. Among them, there were 7 sages in this world. The aura of these 7 sages covered the world and affected everything in the world. The immeasurable cultivators were even more astonishingly affected by the sages. To the countless living beings, the sages were the end of cultivation. To them, the sages were their ultimate pursuit. Therefore, everything about the sages was naturally revered by the countless living beings. Under such circumstances, almost all the cultivators in the world could be said to be related to the sages, or they would painstakingly think of ways to get to know the sages and become their disciples, or they would think of ways to interact with the cultivators related to the sages, or they would become good friends with the sages, or they would become the disciples of the sages. Just like that, they would weave a huge network that covered all the living beings in the world. All the cultivators. To Luo Fan, this was so unbelievable. It made him feel that the abilities of the sages were so shocking. But to the cultivators of this world, it wasn't the same. After all, the sages had supreme abilities and were terrifying existences that could do anything. Something slipped through the gaps of his fingers. For ordinary cultivators, this was already an unimaginably powerful fortuitous encounter, and it was enough to make them feel indescribably excited as it could bring them boundless benefits. Under such circumstances, it was obvious. The cultivation level of this world was many times higher than that of the Earth universe, or even that of the sages of the later generations. In this world, the sages were the supreme existences. But apart from that, there were also an unbelievably large number of powerful cultivators among the endless cultivators. Luo Fan could sense that there were hundreds of peak quasi-saints on these 4 continents alone. Many of them weren't much weaker than Wu Daozi. Below the pinnacle quasi-sage, there were tens of thousands of great perfection quasi-sages. One could well imagine the strength of its power. There were already tens of thousands of great perfection quasi-sages, let alone intermediate quasi-sages and small perfection quasi-sages. As Luo Fan observed the various situations in this world, the more he observed, the more he thought about it, the more horrified he felt. There were so many cultivators in this world and so many mysteries. In comparison, the age of Dharma ending was like a small ditch, and this world was like an ocean. It was Luo Fan. When he saw this clearly, he felt that he had been looking at the sky from the bottom of a well, and he felt an indescribable sense of loss. Luo Fan floated in the void at the center of the 3-dimensional talisman. With a slight thought in his mind, the light and shadow that appeared on the surrounding 3-dimensional talisman changed, and it instantly locked onto the numerous connate grand heavenly realm cultivators that he had brought over from the age of chaos when he was observing the world. In other words, even the weakest connate grand Luo cultivators had broken through to the connate grand Luo, and were only one step away from the sage-to-be realm. After all, these cultivators could be considered fellow countrymen to Luo Fan. When he sent them away, he naturally didn't say that he was so noble as to not let them get hurt. It was more to fulfill his original promise, and at the same time, he didn't want to be a burden to himself. However, he had to admit that he did have such intentions in his heart. Now that he had the chance, he naturally wanted to show some concern for them. Light and shadow flickered around him, and the images of the dozens of people kept flashing in front of Luo Fan. Soon, Luo Fan already knew the status of each and every one of them. These fellow countrymen of Luo Fan had already gone their separate ways after more than 200 years of development. Among them, most of the connate grand Luo cultivators had joined sects in the Dongxing Divine Continent, Nanzhan Divine Continent, Aparagodania Continent, and Beiju Continent. However, only the more outstanding ones among them could do so. There were even many cultivators who couldn't meet the requirements of those sections. Most of the sects in the 4 continents were established by greater or peak sage-to-be existences. There were so many experts in this world. There were hundreds of peak sage-to-be, and tens of thousands of greater or greater sage-to-be. Apart from the disciples of sages, only peak sage-to-be and greater sage-to-be could establish a sect. Which peak sage-to-be and greater sage-to-be were not geniuses. Such geniuses were naturally not the standard of geniuses that could be achieved by ordinary people. Clearly, cultivators who were about to become sage-to-be were merely ants to them. Of course, they couldn't be considered weak. However, it was even more impossible to say that they were superior. Under such circumstances, they could be said to be neither high nor low. Given their strength, they could be said to have reached a certain level and were almost set in stone. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to achieve supreme cultivation, they would need to spend unimaginable resources and energy. If they weren't geniuses that could tempt them, they wouldn't have joined their sects, and they wouldn't have spent so many resources and energy on them. Although it was very rare for cultivators to become connate grand luo cultivators in the harsh environment of the age of Dharma ending and could be considered geniuses, there were very few who could meet their requirements. A small number of them were valued enough to join their sections. To the cultivators of this world, this was already extremely unbelievable. However, to Luo Fan, it was very sad and made him feel helpless. After all, these cultivators were powerful existences that were not much weaker than him in the past. Now they even joined sections. They all needed to be picked and chosen. However, not all of them made Luo Fan feel helpless. There was one person's experience that made Luo Fan feel happy. That person was the Martial Emperor, who was the closest to Luo Fan. The Martial Emperor's experience was completely different from other cultivators. Other cultivators painstakingly requested to join a certain sect, but the Martial Emperor was painstakingly pursued by other sects, wanting him to join their sections. The difference was almost the complete opposite. Everyone was dumbfounded, and the other cultivators were both envious and jealous. When Luo Fan saw the Martial Emperor's experience, he knew that the Martial Emperor had completely implemented the guidance that he had given him back then into his every move. At this moment, even if the Martial Emperor had not completely created his own world view of martial arts, he had definitely gained a lot. This was something that completely separated him from all the other cultivators. Creating one's own worldview was the first sign of completely creating a cultivation method that was completely suitable for oneself. It was also the first sign of completely unleashing one's full potential. In other words, anyone could do it. It didn't matter if they were strong or weak, wise or foolish. As long as they could completely organize their own worldview and create their own cultivation method based on this worldview, then they would be absolute geniuses, geniuses that could look down on all geniuses in the world. There was only one reason for this. Creating one's own worldview would completely change one's view of the outside world. Towards the world. Towards the universe, towards the world. This would cause the Martial Emperor's Dharma body to undergo an earth-shattering change. This change would allow him to use his own method to reach the origin. In terms of cultivation, it would naturally be successful. It was not to say that there were no bottlenecks at all, but those bottlenecks were all traceable. Compared to ordinary living beings, those bottlenecks were many times weaker. Under such circumstances, if he was not a genius, then who could be called a genius? This kind of change in bottlenecks could actually be seen clearly from Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan had encountered so many bottlenecks, every time he seemed to be stable and unshakable, this statement was wrong. One should know that Luo Fan's bottlenecks were so powerful, and even the one he encountered at this time, the bottleneck between the Transcendent Realm and the Tao Master Realm, was so powerful that it almost made him feel despair, and even made him doubt whether he could break through. However, compared to the bottlenecks encountered by other cultivators, his bottleneck was tens of thousands of times smaller. Take the bottleneck from the Tao Integration Realm to the Transcendent Realm as an example. For Luo Fan to break through this bottleneck, it only took him thousands of years to go through two worlds. If other living beings wanted to achieve the same breakthrough, the bottleneck was so strong that even if they found the right method, it would usually take them tens of billions of years to achieve it. Before the Dharma ending age, the Sage era and the Cultivator era were the two eras that were most suitable for cultivation. However, there were only a few dozens of great accomplishment sages to be, which showed how difficult it was to achieve such a breakthrough. The barrier between great accomplishment sages to be and peak sages to be, which was the bottleneck between Luo Fan's Transcendent Realm and the Tao Master Realm, was even more difficult. There were 7 sages in this world. Almost every once in a while, a sage would impart techniques to the world. There were also sages who would give pointers to cultivators like Wu Daozi. Without the burden of the samsara, there were only hundreds of peak sages to be and tens of thousands of great accomplishment sages to be. From this point, it could be seen how difficult it was for ordinary cultivators to break through the bottleneck. Luo Fan could easily reach the end of the transcendent realm from the primordial zenith heaven realm just by passing through the transcendent path. He was simply a legend among legends, a legend among legends. He could be said to be a genius among geniuses. Most importantly, when he entered the transcendent path, he had already realized the existence of the world outlook. He realized that in order to achieve the supreme breakthrough, he had to sort out his own world outlook. After that, after attaining the transcendent realm, he completely sorted out his own world outlook. Thus, he could easily reach the end of the transcendent realm and achieve the incredible cultivation realm he had today. From this, it could be seen how important it was to sort out one's own world outlook for cultivation. In contrast, after receiving the advice from Luo Fan, the martial emperor knew that the most important thing in cultivation was to sort out one's own world outlook. He knew that no matter how he cultivated, if he couldn't have his own world outlook, it would be all for naught. It was impossible for him to attain the transcendent realm that he dreamed of. Under such circumstances, he was naturally leaning in this direction. Naturally, he no longer blindly believed in his own cultivation method. Instead, he constantly changed these cultivation methods according to his own world outlook, making them more and more suitable for himself. As a result, his cultivation speed became faster and easier. On the surface, it showed that his talent was getting better and better, stronger and stronger. This was a sign that he was becoming more and more talented. In this world, the cultivation civilization was so advanced that there were countless methods to determine whether one was a cultivation genius. Naturally, there were countless methods to find geniuses. A cultivation genius like the martial emperor was as conspicuous as a firefly in the dark. Over the past 200 years, the number of cultivation sects that sought him out was unimaginable. They offered countless conditions to entice the martial emperor to join their sections. Some even offered conditions that could help the martial emperor reach the peak of the sage-to-be peak directly. A guarantee that a cultivator could reach the peak of the sage-to-be peak directly was an irresistible temptation for any living creature. Even in the prosperous world of cultivation, there were very few cultivation sects that could offer such temptations. Chapter 10-11. Under such circumstances, there were dozens of sects that directly declared to the martial emperor that they had such confidence. From this, it could be seen how much importance they attached to the martial emperor's genius. One could imagine how much they thought of the martial emperor. Even the disciples of the saints did not dare to casually declare this to others, but there were many who dared to declare this to the martial emperor. If it was not because of Emperor Wu's talent, how could it be possible that the genius of Emperor Wu had given them so much confidence? However, Emperor Wu did not even spare a glance at this situation that made the eyes of the other cultivators turn red with envy and jealousy. He politely declined the invitations of the people from those sects and their claims. He did not say anything unpleasant, nor did he do anything unpleasant. He just politely declined them one by one, as if he was a good person. After all, cultivation sects were cultivation sections. They were not like the gangs in the legends, who said that they would destroy everything if they could not use it. What they pursued was transcendence, to become a saint. Since the martial king wasn't willing to join those sects, the people of those sects could only express their regret and disperse. As a result, in the past 200 years, the martial emperor continued to wander the world by himself. It seemed as if everything in the world was a mystery that he could take as he pleased. All he needed to do was to continuously take and make it his own. There was no need for him to seek external help, much less join other sects or clans. The reason why Emperor Wu made this choice was because of Luo Fan. It was because Luo Fan had given him pointers. This made him understand that his cultivation was completely different from all other living beings in the world, including the saints. As a result, he felt that it was better for him to just wander between heaven and earth than to join other sects and clans. It was better for him to learn from heaven and earth and learn from nature. That was the truth. Emperor Wu's cultivation, in addition to his cultivation of martial arts, mostly relied on martial arts to explain the world. For him, he had already explained a little about the Earth universe in the Age of Chaos. He had already gotten a rough idea, which was quite a bit. Now, facing the world that had broken into the Earth universe, his previous explanations seemed a little behind. He seemed a little behind. There were some omissions. Therefore, he only needed to explain the world with his own martial arts, and then combine it with his previous explanation of the Earth and the universe in the Age of Chaos. Naturally, he would be able to greatly expand his somewhat crude martial arts worldview. To him, this was the greatest improvement. He believed that no matter which sect he joined or which person he could receive guidance from, it would not be as good as what he was doing. Of course, this was based on the pros and cons. There was another reason why the martial emperor chose not to join any sect. He wanted to find a person, Luo Fan. When the martial emperor and the others had been released from the world Luo Fan had created, they had glanced over Qilin Cliff and where Luo Fan and Wu Daozi were. However, the time had been too short, and Qilin Cliff was too mysterious. As a result, even though they had glanced over it, they had no idea where it was. They did not know where Luo Fan was, or if he was in any danger. As the martial emperor had a deep friendship with Luo Fan, he knew very well what kind of person Luo Fan was. He knew that if Luo Fan had not been unable to control himself, he would not have sent them away in such a hurry. Even if Luo Fan's cultivation level was tens of thousands of times higher than theirs, it would not have been like this. Under normal circumstances, Luo Fan would have at least told them where he was and why he had sent them away. It was precisely because of this that the martial emperor knew that Luo Fan was definitely in a disadvantageous position. With this understanding, how could the martial emperor not wholeheartedly search for Luo Fan? Brother Luo, where are you? Where is that Taoist field that looks like a sacred place? While Luo Fan was concentrating the light and shadow of the three-dimensional talisman on the body of the martial monarch was sitting cross-legged on a tall mountain, looking up at the sky and muttering. The 3D talisman's detection was not limited to light. If Luo Fan wanted to, it would naturally not be difficult for him to obtain the voice within it. As a result, Luo Fan heard those words. Luo Fan could not help but smile when he heard those words, and an indescribable warmth surged in his heart. I never thought that Brother Wu would still remember our friendship from back then after such a long time. To Luo Fan, taking the martial emperor and the others into the world he had created had only happened a few tens of thousands of years ago. However, compared to the martial emperor, because time flowed extremely quickly in the world that Luo Fan had created, they had not lived there for just tens of thousands of years, but hundreds of millions of years. Such a long time was enough to erase all traces. Putting aside the fact that the friendship between Luo Fan and the martial emperor had only been a few tens of thousands of years, even a friendship of billions of years or tens of billions of years could be completely wiped away by such a short period of time. From this perspective, it was quite rare for the martial emperor to face Luo Fan with the same attitude as before. It's a pity that I can't help Brother Wu now, Luo Fan sighed after sighing. Although he seemed to be free in Qilin Cliff, he was actually tightly restricted. Let alone leaving Qilin Cliff, even the slightest bit of power would cause Wu Daozi to react violently. Being able to detect everything in the world was practically the limit of what he could do. Clearly, it was impossible for him to help the martial emperor with just his senses. At this moment, the martial emperor suddenly raised an eyebrow. Why does it feel so familiar? He mumbled as a look of reminiscence appeared in his eyes. After a long while, he suddenly stood up and raised his head to look at the sky. He said, "Is it you, Brother Luo? This feeling is exactly the same as when you tried to detect me back then, but it's a billion times weaker. If it weren't for the fact that I'm extremely familiar with this kind of detection, I probably wouldn't have discovered it even if it was a billion times stronger. It must be you." Luo Fan smiled when he heard the martial emperor's words, but his eyes suddenly narrowed. Although Luo Fan was delighted that the martial emperor could discover the three-dimensional talisman, it was not enough to cause such a change in his expression. Chapter 10-12. What made Luo Fan's eyes narrow was that, if the Emperor Wu could sense his senses, what about the other cultivators? Although the other cultivators were not as familiar with Luo Fan's senses as the Emperor Wu was, there were still cultivators who were stronger than Wu Daozi. Their strength was enough to eliminate this sense of familiarity. In other words, Luo Fan's senses had most likely fallen into the eyes of those peak quasi-sages, and even some great accomplishment quasi-sages. However, they had always pretended not to notice. Of course, this was not a bad thing. However, when he thought about how he had not thought of this before and how he had even investigated some peak quasi-sages from the inside out, this was simply toying with the other party like a fool in front of an intelligent person. Back then, he wondered how those peak quasi-sages had viewed him. How could he not be worried at the thought of this? As he thought about this, Luo Fan suddenly realized that ever since he had arrived in this universe that had not been broken into Earth, he had unknowingly treated this place as another era even though he had been constantly on guard. Unknowingly, he had developed a sense of pride. It was this emotion that allowed him to not be at a disadvantage when facing Wu Daozi. It also allowed him to investigate the entire world without any fear. In other words, although Luo Fan knew that there were 7 sages in this universe, he had always lacked a sense of reverence. This allowed him to see many problems more clearly, but it also caused his actions to deviate from his normal personality. As he focused his eyes, various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Suddenly, he found the source and an indescribable sense of wariness welled up in his heart. I originally wanted to find the location of the sages, but it seems like I will be courting death if I really do this. This thought flashed through his mind. At the moment, the Emperor Wu was on a tall mountain in the North Continent. He stood up and looked at the sky. His eyes were filled with excitement. He was waiting for Luo Fan to respond to him. Although Luo Fan was wary and in awe, it did not mean that he would immediately shrink back like a tortoise. Instead, it was the opposite. He directly focused his senses on the martial monarch. It vibrated slightly. The Emperor Wu could sense that the familiar feeling was changing. Such a change could not transmit a clear message, but at least the Emperor Wu knew that his guess was correct. This familiar feeling came from Luo Fan. As expected, when the Emperor Wu sensed this change, his expression suddenly relaxed. "It's really you, Brother Luo. Since you can still use your senses to investigate the universe, I will not have to worry about your safety for now." Obviously, I didn't have to worry about safety for the time being, so I was relieved. What I should do next is to work hard and cultivate so that I can help you when I find you in the future. The martial monarch sighed. As he spoke, he turned around and left the mountain at a speed that was neither fast nor slow. He walked towards the land of the North Continent. The Emperor Wu's senses did not chase after the Emperor Luo Fan. He was touched by the Emperor Wu's choice, but he did not have much confidence. After all, he was facing a peak sage-to-be. He was even facing the sage behind the peak sage-to-be. Even if there were thousands of great accomplishment sage-to-be, they would not be able to change the situation decisively. The Emperor Wu could barely be considered as someone who had just entered the sage-to-be realm. He was still far from being able to be of any help to Luo Fan. Compared to this gap, billions of years was just a passing moment. With a sigh, Luo Fan focused his thoughts on another cultivator who had not joined any sect. This person. She was none other than the Air Maiden, who had been involved with Luo Fan for a period of time. The Air Maiden was different from the Emperor Wu. She did not start to organize her worldview like the Emperor Wu. However, her innate ability was extremely shocking. The Air Maiden was known as the Spacetime Walker. Although this ability had many magical uses during the Age of Dharma ending, it was not too heaven-defying. After all, it was only a single era in a cycle of 6 billion years. The trend of the era was enough to greatly limit her ability. However, before the world was destroyed, the situation was completely different. There was no trend of the era, no reincarnation of the era, and no barrier of time and space between 6 billion years. In such a world, the Air Maiden's talent could naturally play an unimaginable role. She was many times stronger than she was during the Age of Dharma ending. This talent was enough to turn the Air Maiden, who had not been too talented before, into a peerless genius. Such a genius was also a disciple pursued by many sects in this world. Therefore, one could imagine that the number of sects pursuing the Air Maiden would not be much less than the number of sects pursuing the Emperor Wu. However, for some reason, the Air Maiden rejected these sects one by one. Even though there were sects established by the disciples of sages among these sects, she rejected them one by one. At this moment, the Air Maiden was not in the Beiju continent. Instead, she was in the Nanzhan continent. She was on a mountain that was rumored to be the Heavenly Mountain. She lifted her head and looked at the sky. She seemed to be deep in thought and also seemed to be filled with many worries. It's been more than 200 years. The cultivation environment in this world is shockingly good. I can improve even when I cultivate casually and enter the sage-to-be stage easily. But why don't I feel happy at all? She stood there and looked at the 10 suns hanging high in the sky as she mumbled. Compared to when she first came to this world that had yet to be broken into earth, the Air Maiden's cultivation realm had improved tremendously. Back then, there was still one last barrier between her and the sage-to-be stage, and it was difficult for her to enter the sage-to-be stage. However, at this moment, her cultivation realm had steadily entered the sage-to-be stage. Now, the aura around her was that of a sage-to-be. Although this kind of progress seemed to be just a step, it would probably take millions of years for one to make a breakthrough in normal cultivation, even in this incomparably wonderful holy land of cultivation. However, at this moment, she had already made such a breakthrough in just over 200 years. From this, one could tell how great her improvement was. According to her, she hadn't even cultivated seriously for the past 200 years. She had only gone to cultivate occasionally, yet she had already made such progress. What a shocking achievement! One could imagine. It's such a pity that she didn't join a sect with such talent. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. To him, the Air Maiden was from the same hometown as him. Moreover, she was the one who was close to him back then. He did not treat the Air Maiden as he treated the martial monarch. However, he was different from others. At this moment, when he found out that her choice was so unexpected, he could not help but feel puzzled. He felt pity for her. The Air Maiden was extremely beautiful. She stood on the mountain. The surrounding yuan qi was surging. Under the mountain breeze, she looked like a fairy that had descended to the world. Anyone who saw her would feel their heart palpitate. They felt that she was the synonym of beauty in the world. Sigh. After a long time, the Air Maiden sighed. She turned around and started to walk down the mountain step by step. She did not use any magic. She only relied on her body and her feet to walk down the mountain step by step. This mountain was said to be the Heavenly Mountain. It was easy to imagine how high it was. The entire mountain rose from the ground on a boundless plain. It was probably tens of millions of zhang high. Layers of clouds seemed to spread out at the foot of the mountain. Standing on the top of the mountain and looking into the distance, What one could see was not the boundless land but the endless sea of clouds. In the extremely far distance, one could occasionally see the peaks of a few mountains that were higher than the sea of clouds. At this moment, the air maiden walked down as if she was strolling in the sea of clouds. Even without looking at her magic and cultivation, one would still feel that she was like a fairy. Luo Fan was puzzled by the air maiden's choice. However, he kept his perception on her. He wanted to know why she made such a choice. After a few days, the air maiden finally reached the halfway point of the mountain. Suddenly, she stopped walking. She seemed to be listening. Suddenly, she looked surprised. She looked up at the sky and murmured, "Is that you? Are you looking at me now?" She seemed to be talking to the void, as if she was talking to herself. However, Luo Fan had an inexplicable feeling that she was talking to him. This feeling was so clear that he could not doubt that he was thinking too much. He clearly felt that she was talking to him. How is this possible? Luo Fan exclaimed to himself. Did she really sense my probing? Luo Fan could not help but think so. No matter how he thought about it, this seemed to be the only possibility. However, this was really unbelievable. The reason why the martial monarch was able to sense his probing was because their relationship was very deep, and he was too familiar with his probing methods. As such, he was able to sense his probing through the subtle reactions of his body. As for this air maiden, the only thing that could be considered as communication was when he probed her body and arranged a cultivation method for her according to the condition of her body. This matter had happened tens of thousands of years ago for Luo Fan. For the air maiden, it had happened even longer. Under such circumstances, how could the air maiden sense Luo Fan's probing? Just when Luo Fan could not help but deny his feeling, the air maiden's next words completely destroyed all his thoughts. The air maiden said, "It's been more than 200 years. Why haven't there been any news from you? Where is that Taoist rite? Why are you in such a hurry to send us away? Why didn't you even send us a message to explain?" The air maiden stood there, looking up at the sky. She murmured, as if she was blaming and complaining. When Luo Fan heard her words, he was finally convinced that she was talking about him. At this moment, if Luo Fan still did not know what was going on, he would not be worthy of being called a transcendent realm cultivator. I didn't expect that the changes back then would cause her to fall deeply in love with me. Luo Fan smiled bitterly. Luo Fan had never thought that a female cultivator would fall in love with him. Unless it was a special cultivation method or a childhood sweetheart, ordinary cultivators would rarely fall in love after achieving some success in their cultivation. The reason was very simple. As a cultivator, he or she had practically seen through everything. The various desires and emotions of the self had long since been clearly seen through, and the source of all of them had been seen through. Other cultivators and other living beings were all clearly analyzed by his eyes, and he knew the source of their emotions. The other party's true intentions, the other party's personality, and many other things could be seen clearly as long as they spent some time together. Under such circumstances, how could he or she fall in love so easily? How could they so easily give birth to the kind of love entanglement of mortals? This was already the case for ordinary cultivators. 4 cultivators who had reached the connate grand heavenly immortal realm, there was another obstacle that prevented such love from appearing. That was, when a cultivator cultivated to the connate grand heavenly immortal realm, and created a world. To them, creating living beings was a simple matter. In this way, he or she could even create the most perfect life in his or her dreams. Under such circumstances, he or she would no longer have any doubts about any living beings. Without doubts, there would be no interest. Naturally, there would not be any love entanglement. These various factors caused Luo Fan to never think that he would one day fall in love with a female cultivator. Especially when it came to a target of love that had not diminished even after experiencing hundreds of millions of years of friendship. Understanding the air hostess' feelings for him, Luo Fan also understood why the air hostess chose not to join any sect. Just like the martial monarch, she refused to join any sect because she wanted to find him. Luo Fan thought. For the first time in many years, his mind was in chaos. His involuntary chaos naturally spread out, causing his perception of the air hostess to change subtly. This caused the air maiden to be pleasantly surprised. Obviously, this change allowed the air hostess to completely confirm that her senses were correct. The person who was currently sensing and probing her was indeed the Luo Fan that she had been searching for over 200 years. "It's really you, the air hostess murmured. If she could still find traces of that indifferent expression from before, then she would be able to find it now. Currently, she no longer had the calmness she had before. She looked like an ordinary woman who had received news of the person she loved. Simple probing with perception was unable to transmit information. Luo Fan wanted to treat him like a martial emperor. After expressing his existence, he would no longer care about her. However, he found that he couldn't bring himself to do so. "It seems. Although I've cultivated to this level, I haven't changed much from before." Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. Even if he didn't want to be with a female cultivator who had sacrificed so much for him, he couldn't just ignore her. Forget it. If the other peak quasi-sages can sense it, Wu Daozi should be able to sense it too. Since he didn't stop me, I believe he won't mind if I do more things. Luo Fan sighed. After sighing, he gathered his will and directly poured it into the 11-layered three-dimensional talisman he was at. Through the magical effects of the three-dimensional talisman, he relied on his senses and headed towards the mountainside of the Nanzhan section continent's heaven-reaching mountain. I finally couldn't help it. It seems that the relationship between you and those people is very different. At this moment, Wu Daozi, who was at the edge of Qilin Cliff, suddenly raised his eyebrows and said softly with a smile that didn't seem like a smile. Just as Luo Fan expected, when Luo Fan used his perception to observe the entire world through the talisman, Wu Daozi had already noticed it. However, he knew that he couldn't stop it at all. Or rather, he couldn't completely stop it. Even if he were to stop it now, he wouldn't be able to stop it all the time for hundreds of millions of years in the future. Luo Fan could always use various methods to achieve the same effect as his perception. Since Luo Fan would be able to sense the entire world one day and understand the true appearance of the world, what was the point of stopping it now? It was better not to waste time and let Luo Fan sense it. As long as he sensed it clearly and got tired of it, he wouldn't do it again. That was why there was a situation where Luo Fan wantonly explored the world, but no one cared about it. As for why the peak quasi-sages who were being probed by Luo Fan didn't react, the reason was even simpler. It was because with their cultivation level, they could already discover the source of the detection. In other words, they could discover that Luo Fan was currently at Qilin Cliff. Since he was at Qilin Cliff, no matter what, Luo Fan naturally represented Wu Daozi, the disciple of the all-demons ancestor. With Wu Daozi's identity as a disciple of a saint, even if he went to their door and ordered them around, as long as he didn't touch their true interests, they wouldn't take it to heart, let alone just using their perception to investigate. Wu Daozi now sensed that Luo Fan had sent his thoughts through his perception in an extremely secretive but obvious way to peak quasi-sages. He couldn't help but laugh in his heart. However, just as Luo Fan had expected, he did not stop her. He allowed the thought to pass through his perception to the mountainside of the sky-reaching mountain in the Nanzhan section state and directly poured into the mind of the Space Maiden, allowing her to receive countless information in a trance. Chapter 1013. After receiving this information, the air hostess froze. Her expression kept changing. After a long time, she let out a long sigh. There was a sense of relief in her eyes, but there was also a hidden worry. So that's how it is. I understand now. Become a great completion quasi-sage in 3. 6 billion years? I will definitely do it, the air hostess murmured. As she spoke, she took a step forward and directly teleported through space to head towards the location of a certain sect in the Nanjan section continent. He was planning to join a sect. That sect was founded by a female peak quasi-sage. The entire sect was made up of women. Back then, the air hostess was one of the sects that invited the air hostess to join. It was just that the air hostess had something on her mind and was not interested in cultivation. That was why she rejected the recruitment of this sect. However, even though the sect was rejected, they only expressed their regret and said that if the air hostess changed her mind, she could join their sect at any time. Their sect's doors were always open for the air hostess. With this promise, even if the air hostess did not have a smooth journey, it would not be too big of a problem for her to join the sect in the end. Luo Fan watched the air hostess leave, but he didn't chase after her with his perception. Instead, he withdrew his perception that had spread between the heavens and the earth. He returned it to the three-dimensional talisman on Qilin Cliff. Although Wu Daozi had sensed the existence of the information he sent to the air hostess with his perception, apart from the air hostess, no one else who was not a sage could sense it. As Luo Fan had already retracted his perception, the other peak quasi-sages did not check on them. Of course, it was impossible for them to sense the information contained within. In reality, if Wu Daozi had not been too close to Luo Fan, he would not have been able to sense the information. After all, Luo Fan did not cover Wu Daozi with his perception. Without this kind of guidance, it was naturally difficult for him to detect the air hostess. Therefore, apart from the unfathomable sages, Luo Fan believed that the information only had the target. Only the air hostess would be able to sense the information. The information that Luo Fan sent to the air hostess. He did not follow the air hostess's wishes and tell her where he was. This information only contained his current situation and the future of this world. Tell her. He was currently very safe. It was in the dojo of a sage. The epic vortex was created by that sage. For some goals that he still couldn't understand, he pulled them, the later generations, into this universe that had yet to break into pieces and become Earth. At the same time, he told her that apart from Luo Fan himself, they were all safe. No one would do anything to them. In Luo Fan's eyes, there was no scheme involved in letting them leave. He also told her that it would take another 6 billion years for this world to shatter, and that all living beings in this world would cease to exist. At the same time, with the current cultivation realm of the empty girl, even if she found him, it was absolutely useless. Unless she could become a great accomplishment sage-to-be, then she could barely participate in the plan of the peak sage-to-be or sage that he would encounter in the future. Moreover, Luo Fan even gave her a guess. The plan was very likely to happen after 6 billion years, when the world would shatter. There was a lot of information, but it was not a problem for the air hostess, who had just become a sage-to-be. She easily understood what Luo Fan meant. It was precisely because of this that she changed her mind and went to the sect that she had previously rejected in order to join. She was not a martial emperor. Although her cultivation method had been modified by Luo Fan, she had not transcended the shackles of ordinary cultivators. Therefore, she was still in the category of ordinary cultivators. For ordinary cultivators, joining a sect and becoming a rogue cultivator were two completely different situations. In contrast, joining a good enough sect would make one's cultivation speed several times faster than becoming a rogue cultivator. Moreover, it would be smoother and there would be fewer obstacles. Obviously, this was the best choice for a cultivator who wanted to quickly improve his cultivation realm. When Luo Fan retracted his perception, Wu Daozi suddenly said, "Is that your Dao companion?" This voice directly followed Luo Fan's retracted perception and was transmitted to Luo Fan's mind. This method was exquisite and indescribable. It directly destroyed the layers of defense of Luo Fan's three-dimensional talisman. It could not obstruct his voice at all. This was completely different from when Wu Daozi lost his composure in anger. Luo Fan sighed. He knew that Wu Daozi knew what he was doing. He sighed, "Not a Dao companion. Is that so? If they are not a Dao companion, then you are willing to take the risk to transmit your thoughts. I can't see that you are such a kind person." Wu Daozi's expression was calm, but there was a hint of mockery in his eyes. It was as if he felt that Luo Fan's words were as credible as the saying, "Dog poop is fragrant." "Is Dao companion very free right now? Why do you have the time to care about this?" Luo Fan asked. What do I have to do? Right now I am just waiting. It is appropriate for me to care about Dao companion's relationship." Wu Daozi seemed to feel that he had the upper hand and smiled. "Looks like I really didn't give Dao companion any face before and caused your Dao heart to be damaged. Now, just like this, you feel like you have the upper hand and are so proud." Luo Fan's words were also calm and indifferent. These words caused Wu Daozi to frown. The pride in his heart completely disappeared. He snorted and was too lazy to talk to Luo Fan anymore. The topic of Luo Fan's thought transmission was naturally cut off at this point. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled and sealed the 11 layers of the talisman again. He once again isolated all the words and thoughts from the outside world. Of course, though it was isolated, it didn't mean that he had lost all sense of the outside world. It also didn't mean that all the words and messages from the outside world couldn't affect him. Reality was, those words, those messages could be detected by him and received by him. However, they were first filtered by the talisman. Those that didn't meet Luo Fan's requirements stopped at the level of the talisman. Only those that met Luo Fan's requirements could be recognized by the talisman. They could pass through layers of defense and arrive at where Luo Fan was and be received by him. And this talisman, Luo Fan didn't change it back to its original appearance. Instead, it revealed a sea of clouds. When Luo Fan sat there, it was as if he was sitting in a sea of clouds. He looked ethereal and ethereal. Then, Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes. He began to slowly move the blood in his body. As he moved his spiritual energy, it naturally created spiritual energy that surged into his blood. It turned into spiritual energy to strengthen his body, increase his strength, and strengthen his fruit of Wei. His mind entered into a mysterious state. In a trance, everything that he had detected before, the universe that hadn't been broken into earth, was clearly recreated in his mind. Even the 4 continents in this world could have their own magical effect. The entire structure of this world should be mysterious. These mysteries were not very important to Luo Fan at this time. For someone who already had his own complete worldview and had created a cultivation method based on this worldview, these mysteries, although they were the mysteries of the world and contained unimaginable magical effects, had nothing to do with cultivation. Naturally, they were not important. However, these mysteries allowed Luo Fan to have a deeper understanding of this world, allowing him to become more and more familiar with it. This familiarity allowed him to unleash even more power in this world and unleash even more powerful divine abilities. From this point of view, he could not let go of these mysteries. Luo Fan's memory was extremely amazing. Even if he had only seen it once, he could remember it clearly even after millions of years. What's more, he had just used his perception to explore this world. Therefore, although it was only a short period of time, he had already clearly remembered the shape of the world, the shape of the 4 continents, and the terrain. At this moment, as he thought back, a clearer and more complete world was gradually being rebuilt in his mind. This reconstruction even had all sorts of subtle auras added to it. It was so detailed that it could pass off the fake as the real thing. The moment this reconstruction was completed, an indescribable aura came from Luo Fan's body. This aura was not his own aura, and it was not under his control. The 3D talisman he was in seemed to not exist for this aura at all. It allowed this aura to come out and cover the entire Qilin cliff. Both Wu Daozi and the Chuan Taoist sensed the existence of this aura at this moment. Wu Daozi was naturally shocked when he sensed this aura. The Chuan Taoist, who was decorating the cave residence he had just opened, was indescribably shocked. This aura is clearly the aura of a world. Moreover, it is not an ordinary world, but a terrifying world that is many times more powerful than the vast thousand realms. The Chuan Taoist thought to himself in shock. How is this possible? He is clearly a great completion quasi-sage like me. Even if he is a little stronger than me, he should not be able to activate such an aura. The Chuan Taoist's heart was filled with disbelief. His eyes were full of shock, and even his body was slightly trembling in this aura. The Chuan Taoist did not have a definition of a perfect world. For him, the world was divided into the universe, the vast thousand realms, the medium thousand realms, the minor thousand realms, and the minor thousand realms that were inferior to the minor thousand realms. As for the so-called perfect world and the vast thousand realms, he had never even heard of these existences. It was not just him. Even Wu Daozi would not have known that there was a higher level of the vast thousand realms if he had not been reminded by a sage. Under such circumstances, he naturally could not completely measure the level of this aura. He could only compare this aura with the aura emitted by the vast thousand realms. This person cannot be offended. I must build a good relationship with him as soon as possible. This thought completely occupied the Chuan Taoist's mind. The Chuan Taoist was so shocked, but Wu Daozi was different. He was shocked, not because he had discovered something that was far beyond his ability. Instead, he was shocked because he had discovered something unexpected. How is this possible? Heaven and earth visualization, how could he achieve it in such a short time? It took me 300 million years to complete the heaven and earth outlook, and I even had the heaven and earth illustration bestowed by my master. How could he complete it in just a few days? At this time, Wu Daozi's mind was filled with these thoughts. They were so chaotic that they almost drowned his reason. The heaven and earth observation was a kind of observation method that was widely spread in the world. The observation method sounded very mysterious, but it was actually a method to visualize a mysterious image in one's mind. To be able to completely construct the mysterious image in one's mind was to have completed this kind of observation method. When Luo Fan had just transmigrated to the untainted land, he had activated Pangu's primordial spirit by visualizing Buzhou Mountain and obtained his first cultivation method. The nameless cultivation method was also the Dao fruit Great Dao. And now, if someone could reconstruct the image of Luo Fan in one's mind, it could be said to be a mysterious observation method. Because the current state of Luo Fan's body also contained infinite mysteries, including the infinite mysteries of the transcendent realm. The heaven and earth observation that Wu Daozi mentioned. It was a kind of observation method that reconstructed the entire world in one's mind. Luo Fan could sense the world through his perception. He found that the shape of the world contained some kind of deep mystery. This could allow him to obtain many benefits. This world had existed for trillions of years. There were even 7 sages, cultivators that could discover this. How could there be few? The heaven and earth observation was created because of this characteristic of the world's structure. 4 cultivators in this world, so long as they were able to cultivate a worldly insight, then they would be able to establish a complete world within their hearts, allowing their Tao heart and will to receive the blessing of the entire world. Thus, they would become extremely stable and difficult to be shaken by anything in the outside world. Moreover, if the heaven and earth observation was cultivated well, they would not need to cultivate other cultivation methods. They could directly obtain inspiration from it and create the cultivation method that was most suitable for them. From then on, they could embark on the great Tao of cultivation and reach the transcendent realm. Of course, the cultivation method that was most suitable for them was created based on the world's view of the world. In reality, Compared to the cultivation method that was created based on the world's view of the world, it was still lacking. Billions of years ago, Wu Daozi had spent 300 million years and barely managed to cultivate the heaven and earth temple with the help of his master, the saint ancestor of all monsters. It was because he had only spent 300 million years to cultivate the heaven and earth temple that his master thought highly of him and asked him to take charge of this plan. If that was not the case, the ancestor of all demons had tens of thousands of disciples and dozens of peak quasi-sages. He would not have had the chance to undertake this plan. The reason why it was difficult to cultivate the heaven and earth observation was not to memorize the topography, shape, rise and fall of every part of the world. It was also not to memorize the aura of every part of the world. It might be difficult for ordinary cultivators, but for cultivators who had reached the greater success stage of the quasi-sage realm, it was extremely simple. They could even remember everything clearly with a glance. The difficulty of cultivating the heaven and earth observation was the process of rebuilding the entire world in one's mind. In order to rebuild the world in one's mind must be able to contain such a large amount of information in an instant. In other words, one's mind must be big enough to withstand the reconstruction of the entire world in one's mind. Although this did not mean that one had to engulf the entire world, it was not something that an ordinary peak quasi-sage could achieve. Therefore, ordinary cultivators who wanted to cultivate the heaven and earth observation could only build it bit by bit in their mind. At first, they might only be able to build a mountain, then a mountain range, then an island, then an ocean. In this manner, by continuously refining their mind, they would increase the endurance of their mind. In other words, they would expand the size of their mind. In the end, when the entire world was rebuilt in their mind, they would then be considered to have cultivated the heaven and earth observation. From this perspective, the process of cultivating the heaven and earth observation was also a process of expanding one's mind. When one could finally cultivate the heaven and earth observation, the cultivator's mind would naturally grow to an unimaginable level. This was also the reason why the heaven and earth observation was so valued by cultivators. Even Wu Daozi, who was at the peak of the quasi-sage realm, took 300 million years to complete this process. Under these circumstances, Wu Daozi discovered that Luo Fan was using his perception to observe the world. Then, a few days later, he discovered that Luo Fan's body was emitting an aura that could only appear after cultivating the heaven and earth observation. How could he not be shocked? How could he be indifferent? In an instant, countless thoughts flashed through Wu Daozi's mind. After a long time, he let out a long sigh. People are indeed different from each other. Perhaps it's because of this that Master has brought him to this day. Thinking about this, he overturned his thoughts. Chapter 10:14. The main reason why it was so difficult for other cultivators was because of the endurance of the mind. However, this was not difficult for Luo Fan, who had already sorted out his view of the world. Luo Fan cultivated the great path of the fruit of the way, which was the most suitable cultivation path for him. This method could raise everything he had to the limit he could reach. The mind was naturally one of the aspects that could be improved. Evidently, since a great perfection quasi-sage could cultivate the heaven and earth visualization technique, it meant that at the great perfection quasi-sage stage, the mind's endurance was strong enough to contain the entire world. Since that was the case, with Luo Fan's cultivation at the peak of the transcendent realm, he could naturally do the same. In fact, he could do it even more easily. Because of this, there was a situation that made Wu Daozi dumbfounded and extremely envious. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't know that his actions had caused such a great shock to Wu Daozi. At this moment, he was feeling the wonderful feeling of rebuilding the entire world in his mind. In his mind, that part of the world was so vivid, so vast, and so boundless. In a trance, he felt that the relationship between the world and him had completely changed. It was as if the entire world was protecting his heart and his will at this moment. It was as if he had an incomparably powerful backer. There's actually such a profound mystery in reconstructing the world with one's mind and will? Unbelievable. Luo Fan could not help but sigh when he sensed this change. With a slight thought, the huge world that was rebuilt in his mind suddenly compressed rapidly. In the end, it turned into a pagoda in his mind. This pagoda looked like a real pagoda. Every detail was extremely clear without any trace of illusion. Luo Fan did not deliberately condense the pagoda that was reconstructed from his visualization of the world. Instead, it was the appearance that was naturally formed when he compressed the world as much as possible. It was as if some kind of profoundness that Luo Fan did not understand had been added to it, causing the shape of the world to naturally change into the shape of this pagoda. The profoundness of it. It was hard to describe with words. After the appearance of the pagoda, the boundless and powerful aura that had been emanating from Luo Fan's body began to shrink rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared into nothingness, as if it had never appeared. And that pagoda. But at this moment it was sitting in the center of his mind. It firmly stabilized his mind, making him suddenly feel that his mind, and even his soul had become extremely stable. There was a feeling that even if he encountered the collision of heaven and earth, he would not move at all. Whoosh! Luo Fan let out a long breath. He slowly opened his eyes with a faint smile on his face. I didn't expect to have such an unexpected gain. As he thought of this, he sensed the various changes in his body, and the smile on his face became even more obvious. After carefully sensing, he found that it was not only his mind and soul that had gained benefits from the pagoda. It was his body. His magic power and his fruits of Tao had also gained some benefits due to these changes. This benefit was not the foundation of cultivation, nor did it increase his cultivation. Instead, it made him more compatible with the world. He didn't need to use any special methods to sense the world and could naturally unleash unimaginable power. He didn't need to use it like before. He needed to think about the laws of the world and how they were formed, then use them according to this method. Just as Luo Fan sensed the changes in his body and was about to close his eyes to continue cultivating, suddenly, an incomparably powerful aura shrouded the entire Qilin cliff out of nowhere. This aura was extremely powerful. It was not any weaker than Wu Dao Zi's aura. These auras directly evolved into countless ancient trees in the void, turning the entire Qilin cliff into a primeval forest that had grown for trillions of years in an instant. Humph! Ashenwood Master, what is the meaning of this? Wu Dao Zi clearly recognized the owner of this aura. He coldly snorted. Ha! Fellow Taoist Wu Dao Zi, this is not right. Why is there a fellow cultivator in your dojo who has cultivated the heaven and earth temple, but you won't introduce him to me? A clear voice came from somewhere and spread across the entire Qilin cliff. Although the 3D talisman that Luo Fan was in had the ability to block outside sounds from invading it, it also had the ability to receive the aura of the outside world. Of course, it could also sense what the voice was saying. Thus, Luo Fan could also hear this voice. Hearing this voice, Luo Fan naturally couldn't fall into cultivation as planned. He looked outside through the 3D talisman and saw that the appearance of the entire Qilin cliff had completely changed. Above the void, it seemed that between the 10 suns, there was a figure wearing a Taoist robe floating in the air. That figure was a middle-aged Taoist. The aura that turned into boundless ancient trees and enveloped the entire forest came from this middle-aged Taoist. Luo Fan's eyes narrowed and his gaze instantly saw the appearance of this middle-aged Taoist through the 3D talisman. What a sage-like Taoist! Seeing the appearance of this middle-aged Taoist, Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim. This middle-aged Taoist really had a good appearance. He had 5 long strands of beard, a rosy complexion, smooth skin, and every movement he made was filled with Tao intent. He was definitely an immortal. There was no need to sense it. Just by looking at the change in aura and Wu Daozi's tone, Luo Fan knew that this middle-aged Taoist named Ashenwood Master was a peak quasi-sage that was not much weaker than Wu Daozi. Ashenwood Master, you're meddling too much. This is part of my master's plan. Are you trying to interfere with my master's plan? Wu Daozi said calmly. Ha ha ha, Wu Daozi, don't use the name of the ancestor of all demons to pressure me. Your master is a sage, but isn't my master a sage as well? Your master has a plan, but doesn't my master have a plan? As soon as I sensed this person's aura, I realized that he and I are fated. He seems to be beneficial to my master's plan. Why don't you have him come out and meet me? Ashenwood Master laughed heartily. From what he said, he seemed to be the disciple of a sage as well, but Yi Qingyu didn't know which sage he was a disciple of. There were 7 great sages in this universe that had yet to shatter and become earth. They were the primeval Lord of Heaven, the Taishang Dao Ancestor, the Tongtian Sect Leader, the Grand Mist Ancestor, the Ancestor of all Demons, the Amitabha Buddha, and the Ancestor of Humanity, Empress Hua. These 7 sages were both masters and friends. But in the billions of years they'd known each other, it was impossible for there to be no friction between them and be in perpetual harmony. In fact, there were all sorts of competitions between them. Luo Fan didn't even need to ask around to guess this. Then he heard Ashenwood Master's words. Naturally, Luo Fan could guess it. This time, it was obvious that the All-Demons ancestor was not the only one who had a plan for the 160 million era vortexes that he had borrowed Wu Daozi's hands to complete. The other sages also had their own plans. Ashenwood Master had arrived. Although Yi Qingyu didn't know what his goal was, he didn't think it was to pry for information or cause trouble for Wu Daozi. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan had already made his decision. He smiled and stood up. With a wave of his hand, the 3-dimensional talisman suddenly collapsed and turned into countless 3-dimensional talisman again. Then, they suddenly condensed inwards and directly condensed into a round 3-dimensional talisman ball on his palm. It was the size of a fist and was densely packed. It seemed to be all-inclusive. Ashenwood Master saw the change, and couldn't help but exclaim softly. So you're only a greater completion sage. You're able to cultivate a heaven and earth outlook with such cultivation. Even I am a little jealous of your talent. I am Luo Fan. Greetings, Taoist. Luo Fan smiled. Ashenwood Master took a look and laughed. You're neither servile nor overbearing. I'm even more interested in you now. Why don't you come to my place for a tour? I am confident that my dojo will have some impressive sceneries. It won't be as barren as Qilin Cliff. Ashenwood Master, could it be that you want to fight with me again? Wu Daozi said coldly. Haha, Wu Daozi. Others might be afraid of you, but I am not. If you want to fight, then let's fight. Do you think I'm afraid of you? Ashenwood Master laughed. Wu Daozi's expression changed slightly, but he didn't attack. I understand. So it turns out that you saw that our plan has made progress, while your plan has not made any progress at all. Now you are anxious. Hearing Wu Daozi's words, Ashenwood Master's expression changed as well. My master is the Grand Supreme Tao Ancestor, and also a saint. How can there be any problems with his plan? If there's no progress, then it must be within my master's calculations. Why would I be anxious? Ha! If you weren't anxious, then why would you explain like this? Wu Daozi seemed to have the upper hand and laughed. Luo Fan looked at their conversation. His expression didn't change, and his eyes didn't change either. However, countless thoughts flashed through his mind. So this Ashenwood Master is the Grand Supreme Tao Ancestor's disciple. Looking at him, it seems that if Wu Daozi's plan succeeds, it will affect him greatly. Haha, Taoist Wu Daozi, you're wrong. Ashenwood Master laughed. Where did I go wrong? Wu Daozi also smiled slightly as he spoke in a relaxed manner. Ashenwood Master said, I'm not explaining anything to you. I'm just telling you a fact. It has nothing to do with whether I'm anxious or not. We've known each other for hundreds of billions of years, so I know what you want to say. You also know what I'll say. I won't say anything else. If you don't retreat now, then let's fight. Let me see how much progress you've made in the past tens of millions of years. Ashenwood Master smiled. Then let's fight. If I retreat like this, then I'm not me. After he finished speaking, his aura suddenly shook. In an instant, countless ancient trees rose from the ground and spun in the air. Countless purple lightning bolts shot toward Wu Daozi. The entire process was so sudden that Luo Fan almost couldn't react. Luckily, Ashenwood Master's aura attack wasn't targeted at Luo Fan, but Wu Daozi. Thus, Luo Fan easily dodged Ashenwood Master's aura attack and appeared on the other side of the Qilin Cliff. Although there were ancient trees here, they didn't have much of an impact. Just at this moment, a scream came from the Qilin Cliff. This wasn't Wu Daozi's voice, but the voice of the Qilin Cliff. It was the voice of another cultivator, the voice of the ancestral Taoist. It was clear that the ancestral Taoist's reaction was too slow and he didn't dodge Ashenwood Master's aura attack. Of course, he wouldn't lose his life, but it was certain that he would be heavily injured. Luo Fan didn't care about the ancestral Taoist, so he was only slightly startled. Then, he revealed a look of realization, but he didn't feel anything. At most, he shook his head to express his pity. Wu Daozi faced the endless purple lightning and coldly snorted. At this instant, the Qilin Cliff trembled. All of the ancient trees were directly blasted away by a huge force, and in the blink of an eye, they were separated from Qilin Cliff. They could only float high above Qilin Cliff, unable to fall. As the ancient trees left the surface of the Qilin Cliff, the endless purple lightning also flew out. It was clear that Wu Daozi had used the power of the Qilin Cliff to expel Ashenwood Master's aura from the Qilin Cliff. Ashenwood Master smiled and said, "Not bad. After tens of millions of years, the Qilin Cliff has become much more useful than before." While he was talking, he retracted his aura, and all the ancient trees and purple lightning disappeared in an instant, as if they had never been there in the first place. Then, he raised his hand and pointed. The void trembled. At this instant, a giant ancient tree descended from the sky and smashed down toward Wu Daozi. This ancient tree was like a mountain. As it flew through the void, it was as if countless heavens and earth were stacked together as it smashed down on Wu Daozi. If there was a cultivator with a slightly unstable state of mind, they would be shocked to the core. If a cultivator with an unstable state of mind saw the aura of the ancient tree smashing down, their mind would collapse and their soul would scatter. This ancient tree was clearly not the kind of existence that existed between illusion and reality that was formed by the aura from before. This was a real ancient tree. It was a supreme spell that belonged to Ashenwood Master. Wu Daozi looked at Master Ashenmuzi's tree and smiled. "Your spell has improved a lot compared to tens of millions of years ago. When you used it back then, it wasn't as powerful as it is now." As he spoke, his eyes narrowed and a bird-shaped shadow appeared behind him. The bird-shaped shadow grew with the wind. When it first appeared, it was only the size of Wu Daozi's body. However, in the blink of an eye, it had already grown to the size of the world. It was not the slightest bit smaller than the ancient tree that descended from the sky. After it appeared, the whole world seemed to be torn apart in an instant. Waves of aura that seemed to be tearing everything apart made Luo Fan, who was watching from the side, feel a great impact on his mind. There was a faint feeling of pain. The pagoda formed by Luo Fan's heaven and earth temple displayed its wondrous ability. In that instant it shook violently, directly suppressing his entire mind. He didn't need to use any methods to stop it. Naturally, the aura that could tear everything apart completely lost its effect, no longer able to affect him in the slightest. When Luo Fan sensed this change, he couldn't help but have a deeper understanding of the pagoda that he had obtained by chance. A faint smile unknowingly appeared on his face. The beak of the bird that charged out from Wu Daozi's back was extremely sharp and long. It directly slammed into the ancient tree that Master Ashen Musi had created. In an instant it was like a knife cutting through tofu. The ancient tree was split in half from the middle, and the pressure that felt like countless heavens and earth were stacked on top of each other disappeared without a trace. This was clearly not an easy task for the giant bird. As the ancient tree was cut open, it was constantly being damaged. In the end, when the ancient tree completely shattered and disappeared, the big bird also shattered and disappeared at the same time. Wu Daozi smiled and said, "Why didn't you borrow the power of the Qilin Cliff? If you had used the power of the Dao field earlier, your spell wouldn't have been so weak." Master Ashen Mu looked at Wu Daozi and smiled. Wu Daozi said, "You came from afar. If I used the power of the Dao field to defeat you, I'm afraid you wouldn't be convinced. Then, you would cry to your teacher and it wouldn't look good." "Hee, is that so? Then let's try again." Wu Daozi laughed. As he spoke, his body flickered. It was as if he didn't need to experience time or space. He arrived before Wu Daozi and reached out with his right hand. In an instant, space changed and a world made of trees surrounded Wu Daozi. Wu Daozi frowned. His body flickered and he stomped on the ground. This world shook violently as if it could collapse at any time. However, although it could collapse at any time, it hadn't collapsed yet. Wu Daozi casually pointed and the entire world turned upside down. A feeling of stagnation appeared in Wu Daozi's heart. The surrounding ancient trees seemed to have suddenly come to life, transforming into powerful cultivators. They began moving their arms and legs as they madly charged at Wu Daozi. Their sky-encompassing and earth-shattering magic techniques instantly engulfed Wu Daozi. Wu Daozi said, "Defy the world? To me, it's still a bit lacking." Wu Daozi said indifferently. As he spoke, countless rays of black light rushed out of his body. Each ray of black light pierced through an ancient tree. In an instant, all of the ancient trees were pierced by the black light and were about to return to the appearance of ordinary ancient trees. Chapter 10:15. When he arrived, Wu Daozi waved his hand and a bronze ruler appeared in his hand. He then swung it at Ashen Musi's head. After this bronze ruler appeared, there was no strange phenomenon. There was no mysterious aura, and it did not cause any changes in the surrounding void or time. Even the surrounding energy and matter did not change. It looked like a simple bronze ruler. However, when Ashen Musi saw this ruler, his expression changed greatly. His body trembled and a cloud appeared above his head. There was a towering ancient tree growing on the cloud, and it flew towards the bronze ruler. This cloud was so vast that it could only be calculated in the tens of thousands of miles. The ancient tree seemed to be able to support the sky and the earth. It was so vast that it was hard to describe it with words. However, such auspicious clouds and such ancient trees seemed so small in front of the bronze ruler that was a foot long. It felt like it could not withstand the bronze ruler no matter how hard it tried. Even the small distance between the bronze ruler and Ashen Musi's head seemed to have expanded to the point where it could easily accommodate the cloud and the towering ancient tree. Luo Fan had been watching the battle between Ashen Musi and Wu Daozi. Previously, Ashen Musi's aura was covering it up. Now that there was no aura to cover it up, he could see it even more clearly than before. When he saw this scene clearly, he couldn't help but change his expression slightly. He could tell that the bronze ruler was a magic treasure. However, the power of the bronze ruler was so mysterious. It was simply beyond his imagination, and it was even to the extent that he was utterly unable to determine exactly what rank of magic treasure it was. So, how could he maintain his composure? This magic treasure actually has such a wondrous use. It can erupt with heaven-shaking might in an ordinary moment. It doesn't look like a magic treasure at the peak of the quasi-sage level. Could it be a magic treasure of a higher level? It can't be. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. If this magic treasure was a magic treasure at the peak of the quasi-sage level, Luo Fan believed that he would be able to sense it. Even if it could hide all auras and strange phenomena, he would still be able to sense it. However, at this very moment. But he didn't feel it at all. Even when the bronze ruler was able to suppress Master Tsongmuzi's clouds and ancient trees to such an extent, it was still unable to detect any abnormalities or mysteries. How could an ordinary peak quasi-sage level magic treasure be able to do this? However, it must be said that it was a saint-level magic treasure. Of course, Luo Fan couldn't believe it either. Saints were omnipotent, eternal and undying existences. That level of magic treasure, just the form alone. Just by taking it out, it would be able to suppress everything. How could its might be so weak? It was precisely because of these various feelings that Luo Fan was somewhat unsure of the rank of this magic treasure. Luo Fan didn't know, but Ashen Muzi clearly knew. His actions were extremely fast. After the clouds and ancient trees appeared, he raised his hand. As time and space twisted, a branch that looked like a shoulder pole appeared out of nowhere and appeared above his head. This branch was exactly the same as the bronze ruler. It also looked very ordinary. Other than the fact that it was greener and looked like it had just been broken off from a tree, it was no different from an ordinary tree branch. At this moment, Wu Daozi's bronze ruler had already destroyed the ancient trees and clouds above Master Tsongmu's head. It completely erased them as if it was wiping away the dust on a table. Even though the falling speed of the bronze ruler was slightly affected, the entire process was unimaginably simple. One must know that when the auspicious clouds and the ancient tree appeared, the entire world seemed to have changed. Yet, they were wiped out so easily. One could well imagine how powerful the bronze ruler was. The clouds and ancient trees were clearly closely related to Master Tsongmu. Even though they weren't formed from his origin soul, he still suffered great damage after they were erased. At this moment, although there was a look of relief in his eyes, he spat out a mouthful of blood, and his face became somewhat pale. Master Tsongmu was a peak quasi-sage, so even his blood was extremely mysterious. After he spat it out, it turned into countless strange blood-colored creatures in the void. They screamed and looked like ancient trees, but they also looked like some kind of elongated strange beasts that fled in all directions in the void. Every single one of these blood-colored creatures could easily kill a grand heavenly realm cultivator. They could even put up a fight against a beginner quasi-sage cultivator. Unfortunately, they didn't have much intelligence and could only run around instinctively. Some even tried to burrow into the void and teleport away. However, not a single one of them was able to escape. It wasn't that Wu Daozi or Master Tsongmu used some sort of method to stop them. Instead, it was because the branch and the bronze ruler had come into contact. Both of them looked very ordinary, very ordinary. However, the moment they came into contact, the surrounding space instantly turned chaotic. Whether it was time, space, matter, or energy, they were all shattered and turned into chaos. This naturally included the blood-colored creature that Master Tsongmu had spat out. As for Wu Daozi and Master Ashenwood, they were protected by an invisible barrier. They were not affected at all by the chaos in the area. The two invisible barriers weren't spherical. Instead, they were attached to the surface of their bodies. From afar, it looked like they didn't care about the chaos around them and didn't need any protection as they floated in the chaos. If it wasn't for Luo Fan's shocking senses, he might not have sensed the existence of the barrier at all. This chaos completely destroyed the strange world that Tsongmuzi had opened up earlier. At this moment, Master Ashenwood and Master Wu Dao appeared in the void outside and looked down from the Qilin cliff. It was as if a gray cloud had covered the 10 suns in the sky. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression was solemn, and his eyes were shining. Countless mysterious understandings emerged in his mind. Although Wu Daozi and Master Ashenmu's methods were different, they were very similar. The magic treasures they used were also of the same level. The mysteries of these magic treasures obviously contained some mysteries that were beyond the reach of peak sage to be. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to rely on magic treasures to display their skills. Under such circumstances, he had no teacher to guide him. He could only rely on Luo Fan, who had explored on his own. Naturally, this was an extremely rare opportunity for him to learn about the profoundness of the realm above the pinnacle of the quasi-sage realm. The sage realm was above the pinnacle of the quasi-sage realm. However, it was impossible to become a sage just by breaking through the pinnacle of the quasi-sage realm. If that was the case, then sages would not be so valuable. In the billions of years of the Earth's universe, there wouldn't only be these 7 sages. Luo Fan did not know exactly how to become a sage, but he understood. In order to become a sage, besides breaking through the pinnacle of the quasi-sage realm, there must be many other factors. Many conditions. These factors and conditions definitely contained many profundities that peak sage-to-be couldn't achieve. Therefore, the mysteries of the realm above the pinnacle of the quasi-sage realm did not represent the mysteries of the sage realm. It was very likely that they were just the mysteries of some factors and conditions that had to be met before becoming a sage. However, even so, this was already extremely precious. While Luo Fan was wholeheartedly watching the battle between Master Tsang Mu and Master Wu Daozi, the ancestral Taoist came out of the Qilin cliff in a sorry state. The cave residence that he had spent so much effort to open had already turned into nothingness, as if it had never existed. As for himself, he was in an extremely sorry state. He had even lost half of his body. Even the remaining half of his body was charred black, as if he had been struck by lightning. The ancestral Taoist's face was full of fear. As soon as he appeared, he turned to look at the gray cloud layer in the void that looked like primal chaos. This was not because his perception was very sharp, but because the gray cloud layer was too obvious. The aura that it emitted was not as mysterious as the aura of Master Tsang Mu and Master Wu Daozi, which had incredible combat power. However, it was equally powerful. The ancestral Taoist naturally turned to look at it when he appeared. Although the ancestral Taoist was a great accomplishment quasi-sage, he was much weaker than Luo Fan. Luo Fan could easily see through the gray cloud layer that looked like primal chaos and see Master Tsang Mu and Master Wu Daozi within it. The ancestral Taoist did not have this kind of strength. He only took a few glances at the cloud layer before his body suddenly shook and his aura weakened. Half of his body, which was in the process of recovering, also stopped. "Oh no! I am not strong enough to look at this kind of existence." The ancestral Taoist cried out in alarm and hurriedly looked away, panting violently. Although the gray cloud was not really primal chaos, time, space, matter, and energy were all in complete chaos. It also contained some traces of primal chaos. Without a sufficient understanding of primal chaos, it was impossible to withstand the impact of the chaotic information. Of course, the information did not have the power to hurt the viewer, but it could confuse the viewer's thoughts and cause them to hurt themselves. The ancestral Taoist was in this situation. After looking away, the ancestral Taoist revealed a pained expression. Then, with great difficulty, he fished out a sparkling and translucent pill from the space where he had placed his items. This pill gave off all sorts of strange fragrances and he swallowed it. As the pill entered his stomach, his body quickly wriggled. The half of his body that had been destroyed quickly grew back, and the remaining half of his body, which had been charred black, also returned to normal. In the blink of an eye, it was as if he had never been injured. Even the newly grown body was not as weak as a normal cultivator's newly grown body. Instead, it seemed to be a little stronger than his original body. After doing all this, the ancestral Taoist sat down cross-legged and raised his head to look at the gray cloud layer above. Earlier, he had expended an obviously valuable elixir to repair his body, all for this moment. The ancestral Taoist was only a great completion quasi-sage. Moreover, even crossing the path of transcendence had been a bumpy process, and he had only been able to do so through luck and coincidence. However, he was a great perfection quasi-sage after all. He was not a fool. When he saw the gray clouds in the sky, he knew that it was an extremely unimaginable existence. The profundities contained within were deep and unfathomable. If he could comprehend even a tiny bit of it, he would be able to enjoy endless benefit. It was clear that such an existence was caused by the battle between Wu Daozi and the so-called Master Tsang Mu. Of course, this existence could no longer exist. If he missed this moment, that would be a lifelong regret. It was precisely because of this that he forcefully endured the pain in his heart and used the pill that he had spent an unknown amount of time and effort to refine in his later life. For it was to raise his condition to its peak. This was so that he could withstand the impact of the information contained in the gray clouds in the sky. He would be able to obtain more benefit. That pill was the eternal celestial pill, and its effects were extremely shocking. However, when a cultivator's body, divine soul, or any other part of their body was injured, it could instantly recover to its peak. Furthermore, it had been going on for several days. In other words, no matter how severely injured the ancestral Taoist was, as long as his life was not instantly erased, he would be able to instantly recover to his peak state after consuming this pill. Moreover, this state could be maintained for several days, allowing him to instantly recover no matter what kind of injuries he suffered, including injuries to his divine soul and will. It was equivalent to not being injured for several days. The eternal celestial pill's effects were so miraculous that one could imagine how precious it was. The ancestral Taoist had spent billions of years, almost 10 billion years, but he had only managed to refine 3 of them. 2 of them had been used up when he was being chased by a peak quasi-sage. The pill that he had just consumed was the 3rd and final one. However, the injuries that he had previously recovered were injuries that he could have recovered from in a dozen breaths. Although this seemed like a waste, the ancestral Taoist felt that it was very worth it. If Luo Fan knew about this, he would also feel that the ancestral Taoist's decision was decisive and correct. The ancestral Taoist sat there, looking up at the gray clouds in the sky. His eyes flashed as if he had comprehended something, but he kept spitting out mouthfuls of blood like a faucet. However, even though he was spitting out blood, it didn't make him waver, nor did it leave any marks on his body. Every time he exhaled, a faintly discernible fragrance would spread from his body, healing all the injuries he had suffered, including his body, his soul, and even his mind, allowing him to return to his peak condition. So that's how it is. It turns out that there's such a mystery. It turns out that I went the wrong way. Such murmurs kept coming out of Chuan Zong Daoist's mouth along with his blood. Ancestral Taoist Chuan was a great accomplishment quasi-sage. Although the blood he spat out did not turn into a powerful lifeform comparable to innate Grand Luo like Master Ashen would, it was still extraordinary. Every time he spat out a mouthful of blood, the void would distort and change, as if it wanted to turn into something. If it was somewhere else, the blood might really turn into some strange lifeform after a longer period of time. However, this was the Qilin Cliff, so such a thing naturally wouldn't happen. Before the blood could take any form, it fell to the ground and was sucked into the ground of the Qilin Cliff, disappearing without a trace. Then, faint green began to grow where the blood landed. The ancestral Taoist's cave abode had been cleared to the ground. After his cave abode was destroyed, it turned into ruins without any life forms. But at this moment, after his blood fell to the ground became lush and green again, and all kinds of plants began to grow. As the ancestral Taoist underwent these changes, his aura couldn't be suppressed and began to spread out uncontrollably. Moreover, it began to rise at a visible rate. This clearly meant that his cultivation level was also slowly increasing along with it. Luo Fan was originally observing the battle between Wu Daozi and Song Muzi, so he didn't pay any attention to the ancestral Taoist. However, when the ancestral Taoist's aura spread in all directions and affected him, he thought of something and looked in the direction of the ancestral Taoist. When he looked over, he saw the ancestral Taoist sitting there with his legs crossed, looking up at the cloudy sky that was as chaotic as the clouds. He spat out mouthfuls of blood, looking extremely tragic. And after every mouthful of blood, there seemed to be some kind of power flashing through his body, healing the injuries that his body, soul, and mind had suffered, allowing him to have the strength to continue vomiting blood. However, even though he vomited blood, the miraculous power in his body continued to heal his injuries. His aura was not affected at all and began to rise at an astonishing speed. Although he was still far from breaking through to the great accomplishment of quasi-sage, he was getting closer and closer to it. Chapter 10:16. However, this thought only lasted for a moment. Right now, the most important thing to him was not the Patriarch heirloom, but the battle between Master Ashen Wood and Master Wu Dao in the gray clouds where even time and space were blurred. One of them held a bronze ruler while the other held a pole-like tree branch. They fought like ordinary cultivators. Ashen Muzi had already recovered from his previous injuries. After all, he was a peak quasi-sage. No matter what kind of injuries his body and soul suffered, he could naturally recover with time. In this chaos, time and space were all messed up. What happened just now seemed like a few breaths, but to Wu Daozi and Ashen Muzi, it felt like several days had passed. This was enough for Ashen Muzi to refine his mortal body to its peak state. How could he not recover from such minor injuries? The two of them exchanged blows in that gray haze. Every move they made contained endless mysteries of martial arts. If anyone were to look at them, they would be able to comprehend the profound principles of martial arts. Even if a martial king saw this, he would definitely be enlightened. The enchanted treasures in their hands, the bronze ruler and the tree branch, looked ordinary, but when they clashed, they caused the gray, chaotic environment in the surroundings to be unable to recover. Instead, as the battle progressed, it became more and more chaotic and more difficult to deal with. Wu Daozi, is this all you've got? If that's the case, I'm afraid you'll have a hard time today. Ashen Muzi's expression was calm. A tree branch flashed through the void, creating 7 afterimages, blocking the 7 attacks of the bronze ruler. Ashen Muzi, you can try and see if this is all I have. Wu Daozi chuckled. He did not care about being blocked by the tree branch. He casually turned his hand and drew a mysterious path. It was almost like a grand Dao as it directly attacked Ashen Muzi's forehead. Ashen Muzi coldly snorted. He raised his hand. The tree branch released a rainbow light that swept towards Wu Daozi. This ray of colorful light was extremely mysterious. In a flash, the chaos in the surroundings seemed to have been sucked in by a whale. It poured directly into the colorful light. It was directly swallowed up. The clouds in the sky. Naturally, it disappeared without a trace, and the two of them appeared directly outside. This change made Luo Fan's eyes light up. This rainbow light is actually higher than the Great Tao. It can practically swallow the heavens and the earth. At the instant the colorful light appeared, he sensed the boundless profundities contained within the light, and he sensed the charm of being able to devour everything within it. In comparison, the Grand Tao, the heavens and the earth, and the laws of nature seemed to only be its food, and it would naturally be able to devour them completely as long as it exerted the slightest bit of strength. This was obviously another use of the branch that looked like a shoulder pole. It was even more profound and mysterious than the previous one. Seeing this, Wu Daozi's expression changed. I didn't expect you to be able to activate the second use of this treasure. But if you think you can beat me like this, then you're wrong. Although this was a long sentence, it was compressed in an instant. After he finished speaking, the rainbow light didn't even get halfway to Wu Daozi's body. Wu Daozi casually spun the bronze ruler in his hand. A giant shadow flashed on the bronze ruler. That illusory figure was a gigantic humanoid figure. It was a figure that filled up the heavens and earth. It held a ruler in its hand as if it was measuring the great Tao. This human figure's face was blurry, and there seemed to be the shadows of countless beasts flashing and disappearing around it. This human figure blocked the rainbow light from Master Ashenmu's branch. It instantly blocked the rainbow light, making it seem like it was a real object that couldn't sink. The destructive charm of the rainbow light seemed to have never appeared and completely disappeared. The two of them were in a stalemate. The rainbow light couldn't move forward and hurt Wu Daozi. The giant human figure also couldn't hurt Master Ashenmu through the rainbow light. I didn't expect you to also activate the second use of this treasure. Looks like it will be the same as tens of millions of years ago, a draw. Master Ashenmu looked at the shadow and couldn't help but sigh. Originally, he was full of confidence coming here to cause trouble for Wu Daozi. His confidence was because he had already activated the second use of his treasure, but now he found out that his opponent, Wu Daozi, had also activated the second use of his treasure. This caused his advantage to disappear in an instant, and he felt extremely helpless. Wu Daozi faintly smiled. It seems like what Master said before was correct. Our talents and comprehension abilities are similar. Normally speaking, it is hard to pull apart the gap between us. Master Ashenmu shook his head and waved his hand. The branch in his hand waved and the rainbow light returned. Wu Daozi didn't go too far and didn't take this opportunity to attack. He pointed at the bronze ruler in his hand. The giant human figure on the ruler also disappeared without a trace. Wu Daozi said, however, the plan I'm responsible for has been successful, but there is no movement from you. Looks like I will far surpass you in the future. That's not necessarily true. How do you know the plan I'm responsible for hasn't been successful? Master Ashenmu smiled and retorted. Hearing Master Ashenmu's words, Wu Daozi's expression changed, as if he had thought of something. After a while, he said, could it be that the upheaval that happened 1,000 years ago was triggered by the results of your plan? Master Ashenmu smiled and didn't speak. It didn't mean yes or no. Wu Daozi and Master Ashenmu's familiarity with each other had reached an unbelievable level. Seeing Master Ashenmu's expression, he confirmed his guess. He couldn't help but sigh, but he didn't say it out loud. He only said, you have achieved your goal today. The Chilan Cliff scenery cannot compare to your heavenly wood island. I won't keep you any longer. I won't send you off. Hee. Just at this moment, a crisp sound came from nowhere. Then the voice said, I originally wanted to see what kind of amazing cultivator had cultivated the Heaven and Earth Temple, but I didn't expect to see such a good show. Fellow Taoists, your cultivation is truly astonishing. This little girl admires you greatly. Hearing this voice, Wu Daozi and Master Ashenmu both frowned. The two of them turned their gazes to another location. Rain Godchild, what are you doing here instead of serving in the palace? Wu Daozi was the owner of this place. He had the right to ask this question. At this moment, the void twisted and trembled. She was wearing ordinary servant clothes, but no matter how one looked at her, she was perfect and pleasant. No matter how one looked at her, she was beautiful. The woman was smiling at this moment. Her eyes occasionally blinked and she gave off a lively feeling. With a single glance, one could tell that this person was definitely not an obedient girl. Why does Tao brother say this? I have served Saint Emperor Hua for tens of millions of years. Today, the saint was kind enough to give me a few days off, so I used the Heaven and Earth Temple's aura to rush over to meet Tao brother. Why would Tao brother say this? It really hurts. The woman's expression changed very quickly. She was smiling just now, but now her eyes were watery and she looked like she was about to cry. Wu Daozi looked like he had a headache. Hua Huang was the only female saint among the 7 saints, and she had a rather eccentric personality. Unlike the other saints, she didn't take in disciples and preach. Instead, she took in one servant after another. Although these servants were called servants, they were actually her disciples. Their status wasn't much different from the disciples of saints like Wu Daozi. On top of that, because these maids had served Huang many times more than the other disciples of saints like Wu Daozi, they'd improved much faster than Wu Daozi and the others. They'd also been more influenced by Huang, and their personalities had become a little odd. Just like now, he was actually able to say such messy words without even blinking his eyes. Rain Godchild, you've come at the right time. That fellow Taoist who cultivated the heaven and earth temple is quite remarkable. It seems that he's from the later generations, Master Ashenmu chuckled. When Deity Rain heard this, his tearful expression instantly disappeared. Instead, he revealed an interested expression and said, "Someone from the future? I heard Senior Brother Wu Daozi has been carrying out a plan recently. Is it to transfer the cultivators of the later generations here? Where is he now?" "That's right. Look, isn't he over there?" Master Ashenmu smiled and pointed at where Luo Fan was. As for sect leader Chuan, he didn't think much of him at all. Sect leader Chuan was no longer observing Wu Daozi and Master Ashenmu. After the two of them stopped fighting, he'd closed his eyes and entered a deep meditative state. During this process, his aura began to rise at an unimaginable speed. It seemed like he was about to break through the great accomplishment of Sage to Be and reach the pinnacle of Sage to Be. Obviously, even though the battle from before was short, it had already brought him countless benefits, and it was sufficient to advance his cultivation and obtain a considerable improvement. Such an aura and improvement were quite remarkable for sect leader Chuan. However, to Wu Daozi, Ashenmu Zi and Rain Deity Sun, even breaking through the Great Completion Quasi-Sage Peak Great Completion Quasi-Sage Peak Great Completion Quasi-Sage Peak Great Completion Quasi-Sage was nothing in their eyes. Even Luo Fan wouldn't be taken seriously by Master Ashenmu and Rain Godchild if he hadn't cultivated the heaven and earth view. At this moment, Luo Fan was standing there neither servile nor overbearing. Seeing the three of them looking at him, he bowed slightly but didn't speak. He just smiled faintly. Rain Godchild was very interested in Luo Fan. Seeing Luo Fan's reaction, he couldn't help asking, "Are you from the later generation? How did you cultivate the heaven and earth view?" "Heaven and earth view? What's that?" Though Luo Fan could roughly guess what the heaven and earth view was, he didn't know the details, so he still asked. "You don't know the heaven and earth view? Then how did you do it?" Rain Shensi was shocked when he heard this. He looked at Luo Fan as if he was looking at a monster. Even Master Ashenmu looked at Luo Fan in disbelief. Only Wu Daozi, who had been watching Luo Fan's movements, was not surprised. Therefore, he was not surprised at all. His expression was incomparably calm, as if nothing could surprise him. Rain Godchild said and took a step forward. His graceful body had already crossed the void and arrived in front of Luo Fan. He looked at Luo Fan from top to bottom, as if he wanted to find something special about Luo Fan. The heaven and earth view is to visualize the heaven and earth in one's mind and form a complete heaven and earth. At this moment, Master Ashenmu also smiled. He took a step forward and came to Luo Fan's side and said to Luo Fan. Wu Daozi saw that the two of them didn't even ask him before stepping onto his Dao field. His expression couldn't help but turn ugly. However, under these circumstances, what else could he say? He could only sigh. He waved his hand. As the air trembled, a thatched cottage appeared before them. He also appeared in front of the cottage as a result of the change. "Since you're here, sit down and talk. I don't want you to complain to the saints that I don't know how to treat guests." "Haha, you're finally willing to take out your enlightenment thatched hut? Then we'll have to enjoy it. Hurry up and open it." Master Ashenmu's eyes lit up and he laughed. "You should know what we're called, right? How should I address you?" Rain Godchild was also happy, but he first asked Luo Fan. This was not a secret, so Luo Fan smiled and said, Luo Fan greets Dao friend. These words were not much different from what he had said to Wu Daozi before. They were neither servile nor overbearing. You really are interesting. No wonder you can cultivate the heaven and earth view. Rain Godchild giggled. What does being interesting have to do with cultivating the heaven and earth view? Wu Daozi said helplessly. I think you're just jealous of him. I remember you spent 300 million years to cultivate the heaven and earth view, brother. Rain Godchild didn't hesitate to open Wu Daozi's scars. What about you? Though you were better than me back then, didn't you also spend 200 million years to cultivate? Wu Daozi's expression changed slightly, but he quickly retorted. Rain Godchild's expression froze after hearing this. He turned around and saw Master Ashen Mu's smiling face. He couldn't help but say, Brother Ashen Mu, what's so funny? You also spent 300 million years to cultivate the heaven and earth view, didn't you? This. Master Ashen Mu's expression froze after hearing this. The three of them looked at each other for a while and laughed. Luo Fan looked at the appearance of the three of them and knew that the relationship between the three of them was not as tense as he had previously thought. Perhaps there was competition and opposition, but behind this competition and opposition there might be a deep friendship hidden. However, from the words of the three of them, Luo Fan also knew why they came here together, because he had cultivated the so-called Heaven and Earth Temple. So it is so difficult for the cultivators of this world to cultivate this so-called Heaven and Earth view. This kind of enlightenment appeared in his mind. Luo Fan was a wise person after all. He only needed to think for a bit to understand why this would happen. It had been a long time since his mind's endurance had been so astonishing, and he had long since gotten used to it. That was why he did not think that ordinary cultivators could not be as powerful as him. For them, even if they cultivated to the peak of the quasi-sage realm, their mental strength was still far from his current level. It was impossible to completely recreate the entire world in one's mind. Only by visualizing it bit by bit, practicing it bit by bit, and spending a long time could one completely recreate the world. This was why it was so difficult for cultivators to cultivate the heaven and earth view. After thinking this through, he came to a realization. You guys got lucky today, Wu Daozi said hatefully to Master Ashen Mu and Master Rain God as he looked at the grass hut. With that, he waved his hand at the grass hut. In an instant, the straw hut trembled slightly. An indescribable, unimaginably profound aura radiated from the straw hut, enveloping a radius of 100,000 feet around the straw hut. The moment he was enveloped by this aura, Luo Fan suddenly felt his mind become extremely clear. The entire world seemed to become clearer in his eyes. The great Tao that was originally hidden in the dark seemed to have appeared directly in his mind, displaying its mysteries extremely clearly. It was as if he could obtain all the mysteries he needed from it with just a thought. Tao comprehension thatched hut, so this is how Tao comprehension works. When Luo Fan felt this change, he couldn't help but be taken aback. He looked at the thatched hut with some horror in his eyes. This type of Tao comprehension wasn't very useful to him right now. For him, if he wanted to increase his cultivation, he would have to cultivate the grand Tao created by his world view and comprehend the state of chaos. To him, this great Tao was just a reference. However, this type of Tao comprehension was the most precious treasure in the world for other cultivators. Even the two strange treasures that Wu Daozi and Master Ashen Mu took out were not as precious as this Tao comprehension thatched hut. Chapter 1017. In this world, cultivation was the only thing one could truly rely on. Everything else, no matter how powerful they were, was like flowers in the mirror or the moon in the water. They could not become the foundation of transcendence. From this, one could see how precious this enlightenment hut was. Even Master Tsang Mu and Rain Shensi had expressions of enjoyment on their faces. Clearly, they had also benefited greatly from this enlightenment hut. Wu Daozi looked at their expressions and smiled. He was clearly very proud. He waved his hand and a few praying mats floated out from the hut. They landed before them, including Luo Fan. These are enlightenment praying mats. When used with this enlightenment hut, it will be even more wondrous, Wu Daozi said to them. Since he had said so, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't be polite with him. He immediately stepped forward and directly picked the nearest futon and sat down cross-legged. Once he did this, he felt a mysterious aura surge out from the praying mat below him. This aura seeped into his body and surrounded him in the blink of an eye. As he was surrounded by this aura, he felt his mind become clearer. Even the grand Tao projected in his mind became more detailed. With the wonderful effect of this kind of aura, Luo Fan could even guess that if any ordinary creature with a heart full of distracting thoughts were to sit here, they would definitely step into this state of mind clarity that only cultivators with an extremely stable Tao heart could enter. Master Tsang Mu and Rain Shensi also smiled and sat down on the praying mat before them. These praying mats were not placed on the ground. Instead, there was a strange floating force that held them up. After people sat on them, they did not fall down. Instead, they continued to float in the air as if they were floating in the air. Although all of them could easily do this, they still performed like this without doing it, so the feeling was naturally different. The others had praying mats to sit on, but Wu Daozi had no intention of doing this to benefit others. He waved his hand and a praying mat floated out of the hut and appeared before him. This praying mat looked even more intricate than the ones Luo Fan and the others were sitting on. It seemed to be even more wondrous. This is something better to enjoy in front of guests. Instead, they let their guests enjoy inferior food. Wu Daozi didn't feel embarrassed at all. It was as if he had already given the best things to his guests to enjoy while he enjoyed the inferior ones. As expected, Brother Wu Daozi hasn't changed at all. Although you took out all these good items, in the end you will still cause trouble for others. Rain Shensi looked at Wu Daozi. He giggled and said, "This revelation is making things difficult for people? There is only one of this item, but there are two of you. It is not suitable to give it to either of you, and it might even cause a dispute. There is a grudge. Then wouldn't I have done something bad with good intentions? Why don't I use it myself and you two use the same rank one? That way there won't be any problems," Wu Daozi said in a matter-of-fact manner. Master Tsang Mu frowned and said, "It's just a enlightenment praying mat. Do you think the disciples of us sages will become enemies because of it?" Master Tsang Mu frowned and said, "That's not necessarily true. This enlightenment praying mat might not be of much use to you, but its structure contains the mysteries of Tao comprehension. If you can comprehend it, you might be able to comprehend the mysteries. If you are lucky, you might even be able to refine it in the future. How great of a benefit is this? Won't you fight for it?" Wu Daozi snickered. The mysteries of Tao comprehension are just some of the mysteries the ancestor of all monsters passed down to you. Although it is incomparably exquisite, we have also received the grace of the sages. With the same profound inheritance, why would he be interested in this profound comprehension of Tao? Wu Daozi, you are thinking too much, Master Tsang Mu said calmly. If you really don't care like you say, why are you trying so hard to analyze this enlightenment praying mat? Master Tsang Mu said calmly. So what? I just want to see how exquisite this item is. I just want to see what material it is made of. Master Tsang Mu chuckled as if nothing had happened. Brother Tsang Mu Zi, your shamelessness is no less than before. Your shamelessness is no less than before. Rain God Zi covered his mouth and chuckled. Ashen Muzi smiled and asked Luo Fan, to be able to cultivate the Heaven and Earth Observatory in such a short period of time, you must have cultivated a similar cultivation method before, right? At this moment, Luo Fan was carefully comprehending the aura that permeated from the praying mat below, trying his best to analyze the mysteries contained within. although the praying mat was the source of the aura and only the praying mat had this aura. But to Luo Fan, analyzing the praying mat was of no use to him. He didn't need to make this enlightenment praying mat at all. Why would he need to analyze the structure of the enlightenment praying mat? What he needed was the mysteries of the aura. This kind of aura could even affect his mind and cause him to fall into this kind of mysterious state that was similar to an illusion, yet completely different from an illusion. However, its miraculous effects greatly interested him. Naturally, he had the thought of analyzing it to find out what it was. Moreover, as long as he could analyze it and use his worldview of laws, he might even be able to create something that was suitable for him and could deepen his understanding of the state of chaos. Of course, he didn't have high hopes for this. Even the disciples of sages like Master Tsangmu and Rain God Z couldn't take out this kind of enlightenment praying mat. It was already extremely difficult to create something of the same level, let alone something of a higher level. It was not a treasure that comprehended the great Tao, but a treasure that comprehended the primal chaos state. It was more than 10,000 times more difficult to refine. If even Luo Fan had the confidence to refine it, then his confidence was like water without a source, a tree without roots. It was just an illusion. This kind of aura was very similar to the way Wu Daozi and Master Tsangmu used their auras before. It seemed like an ordinary aura, but in fact there were countless complicated structures inside. This structure was exquisite, complicated, and mysterious. It had reached an unimaginable level. Even when Luo Fan looked at it, he could only faintly see that there was a more profound and complicated structure inside. However, he couldn't tell what kind of structure it was, let alone find its true mysteries. He could only know that it was these complicated, exquisite, and mysterious structures that allowed this aura to have such unimaginable power. It could actually connect with the Grand Tao. It could directly project it into the mind of living beings. At this moment, he heard Master Tsangmu's words. After returning to his senses, Luo Fan smiled. Perhaps. Looks like this is your secret, so I won't ask any more. Friend, which era are you from? How long has it been? Master Tsangmu looked at Luo Fan and didn't care. He changed the topic and asked. The era I'm from is the end of the world. How long has it been since then? I'm not too sure about that, but from the experiences I've had, it's been at least 1,000,000 eras. This was not a secret, or perhaps it should be said. For Wu Daozi, it wasn't a real secret. Since it wasn't a secret to him, then it naturally wasn't a secret to Luo Fan. He told Master Tsangmu and Master Rain God. Telling Master Tsangmu and Rain Shensi wasn't a big deal. He looked very comfortable right now, but no matter what happened, it wouldn't change the fact that he was being restricted by Master Tsangmu. If Master Tsangmu didn't want others to know, then he would tell them. If Master Tsangmu didn't care, then he wouldn't lose anything. Hearing this, Master Tsangmu couldn't help but exclaim, 1,000,000 eras? That's 1,000,000 to 5. 6 billion years. I didn't expect it to be so far in the future. End of the world? Looks like you aren't simple. This era doesn't sound like a good place for cultivation, but you, fellow Taoist, have reached such a level. You're truly a genius. Do you want to change your sex and join our envoi palace? Rain Deity's eyes lit up as he asked Luo Fan. Sex change. Luo Fan heard this. He shook his head instinctively. Although it didn't matter to cultivators of this realm whether they were male or female, he had been accustomed to being a man for countless years, so he couldn't accept suddenly becoming a woman. Don't be afraid. Our palace of Empress Enviwa has a special method that can transform you from inside to outside. After the transformation, you'll be a real woman. You won't just be a man at heart and a woman at body. The Rain Deity seemed to be very optimistic about his proposal. No. I think the current gender is good enough. There's no need to change it. Luo Fan's heart tightened as he shook his head. If it was just a physical transformation, he might not care too much about it. However, if his mind also changed, it would completely violate his principles. For Luo Fan, his own mind and will were the supreme and fundamental bottom line. As for other cultivation methods, even corpse-chopping methods, as long as they affected his mind, character, and will, he would directly discard them, no matter how powerful they were. Under such circumstances, such a method that even changed his mind would naturally endanger his fundamental principles. He would never agree to it even if he was beaten to death. There are many benefits to joining Emperor Enviwa Palace. Although Supreme Emperor Enviwa can't directly take you as her personal maid, as long as you stay in Emperor Enviwa Palace, you'll naturally obtain countless benefits, including heavenly materials and earthly treasures, marvelous cultivation methods, immortal pills, and so on. We can even provide you with all the resources you need to reach the peak of the Sage-to-be realm. This is a great fortune. Countless people in the world want to join us but can't get it. Rain Deity's son began to talk about the benefits of joining Emperor Nvua's palace. Hearing this, Luo Fan kept shaking his head. Rain Deity, what are you doing? This man is an indispensable part of my plan. If you take him away, how can I explain it to my master? Wu Daozi shouted with a frown, finding it hard to endure such a blatant act. Brother Wu Daozi, how can you say that to me? The Rain Deity suddenly burst into tears again. He looked at Wu Daozi with teary eyes as if he was a heartless man. The corner of Wu Daozi's eyes twitched as he said, "Can't you speak properly? Why can't I speak properly? Why are you so mean to me?" The Rain Deity was still on the verge of tears. Ashen Musi watched from the side with a calm smile on his face, as if he didn't see anything. Besides, how do you know that Taoist Luo Fan joining Emperor Enviwa Palace wasn't arranged by Uncle Master of all demons? What if this is part of Uncle Master's plan? The Rain Deity's expression suddenly changed. He looked at Wu Daozi as if he was a lost lamb, as if Wu Daozi was walking on the wrong path without realizing it. Hearing this, Wu Daozi opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. For him, a sage was omnipotent and omniscient. Under such circumstances, although the Rain Deity's words were absurd, he didn't dare to deny it completely. Because to him, even though the possibility of such a thing happening was extremely small, it was still a possibility. The abilities of a sage were so profound that even a pinnacle quasi-sage like him could not compare to them. How could a peak sage-to-be like him understand it completely? Luo Fan looked at Wu Daozi speechless after hearing such an absurd reason. In his heart, he had a deeper understanding of how high the word sage was in the hearts of the cultivators in this world. Seeing that Wu Daozi couldn't say anything, the Rain Deity smiled proudly and turned to Luo Fan. Taoist Luo Fan, what do you think? Perhaps Uncle Master of all demons really arranged for you to join Emperor Enviwa Palace. How about you come with me to Emperor Enviwa Palace now? At this moment, Ashen Musi suddenly reacted and hurriedly said, No, no. Perhaps Taoist Luo Fan going to my Skywood Island is also part of the arrangement of the Supreme Sage. I think Taoist Luo Fan should come with me to Skywood Island. Obviously, after being reminded by the Rain Deity, he also thought of an irrefutable excuse to drag Luo Fan to his Skywood Island. As for why the Rain Deity and Ashen Musi wanted to drag Luo Fan to their territory, it was not because of how important Luo Fan was, but because they wanted to affect Wu Daozi's plan. Luo Fan could see this with a glance. He didn't even need to think too much to figure it out. However, whether it was Skywood Island or Emperor Enviwa Palace, Luo Fan would definitely not go there. Even though Ashen Musi and Rain Deity were being friendly to him, they even addressed him as a Taoist, which made him feel that they were really kind to him. In fact, to them, Luo Fan was just a tool that was connected to Wu Daozi's mission. As long as such a tool wasn't with Wu Daozi, they had already achieved their goal. As for Luo Fan's life and death, they probably wouldn't care much about it. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan went to Skywood Island or Emperor Enviwa Palace, what awaited him would be. It wouldn't be the benefit of seeing the mysterious scenery. Instead, he would be thrown into some dangerous place. In fact, they might even directly obliterate him. In comparison, because he was a part of Wu Daozi's plan, he would be very safe here. Before the plan was fully activated, he wouldn't be in any danger. Even after the plan was activated, he wouldn't be in any danger. Knowing this, how could Luo Fan choose to go to Skywood Island or Emperor Enviwa Palace? Therefore, he said to Ashen Musi and Rain Deity, "Forget it. Neither of you can be sure what the Saint Sovereign has planned. If I go with either of you, I might be going against the Saint Sovereign's plans. I might as well stay here." "That's not true." Ashen Musi shook his head. "The Saint Sovereign's plans are impeccable. No matter what you do, it will be the Saint Sovereign's plans. If you go to Emperor Enviwa Palace, it will be the Saint Sovereign's plans. If you come to Skywood Island, it will be the Saint Sovereign's plans. No matter what you choose, you won't be able to escape. So just make your choice." Ashen Musi chuckled. Instead, he carried forward the little idea that the Rain Deity had mentioned before, and even turned it into a logical system that could barely be explained. Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head. "No need. Who knows about the Saint Sovereign's plans? Since I'm here, it's better for me to stay." Hearing this, Ashen Musi shook his head and sighed. He seemed to be very regretful and unwilling to part. Rain Shensi looked at Ashen Musi with admiration. Clearly, he admired Ashen Musi for being able to come up with such a wondrous logic. It was even possible that she was already considering how to use this logic to achieve her own goals. Wu Daozi seemed to be quite satisfied and said to Ashen Musi and Rain Deity, "All right, now that you've seen the Tao Comprehension thatched house and sat on the Tao Comprehension mat, it's getting late. Take care. I won't be sending you off." Rain Deity and Ashen Musi shook their heads. Rain Deity said, "How can we do that? How long have we been here? Not even 2 hours. We haven't seen each other for tens of millions of years, and you're already chasing us away? Is this how you treat your guests?" Chapter 10:18. Master Tsangmu and the Rain Deity only left a few days later. During this time, Wu Daozi's various treasures were extorted by the two of them using various reasons. At the same time, Luo Fan, who was standing at the side, benefited a lot and obtained a lot of benefits. Of course, these benefits were mostly the satisfaction of other enjoyments, such as the desire for good food. The other benefits that were beneficial to cultivation were nothing in his eyes. After a few days, when Master Tsangmu and the Rain Deity finally left in satisfaction, Luo Fan was also very satisfied. He smiled at Wu Daozi and said, "Thank you for your hospitality these past few days." Wu Daozi coldly snorted at Luo Fan's actions. "You and I both know what happened. Why are you so hypocritical?" Hee. Luo Fan just chuckled. He turned around and took a light step forward, once again occupying the area with the best cultivation environment in Qilin Cliff. Then, he released his three-dimensional talisman ball. In an instant, the three-dimensional talisman ball transformed into an 11-layered three-dimensional talisman, transforming into a last day's temple. What he did before was clearly not welcomed by Wu Daozi. It could even be said that he was thick-skinned and shameless. This was clearly not something that Wu Daozi would be happy about. If he really had some friendship with Wu Daozi, then what he did might cause them to become enemies. However, it was clear that Luo Fan and Wu Daozi did not have any friendship. The relationship between them was one of hostility. Wu Daozi wanted to control Luo Fan and make Luo Fan a part of his plan. Luo Fan clearly did not want his fate to be controlled by someone else. This kind of fundamental contradiction made it so that even if he lived in the Qilin Cliff for billions of years, he would not form any friendship with Wu Daozi. Since it was impossible to form any friendship, then he naturally did not care about what Wu Daozi thought. In the past few days, He had come over to eat and play. The reason was not because he wanted to eat and play, but because he wanted to annoy Wu Daozi. As for Wu Daozi, because Luo Fan was part of his mission, no matter what he did, he wouldn't do anything to him. Therefore, even if Luo Fan stubbornly leaned over and insisted on eating, drinking, and playing, he could only pinch his nose and accept it. Because of the existence of Master Tsang Mu and Rain Deity Zi, he had to treat Luo Fan the same. This was to avoid giving them an excuse to forcefully take Luo Fan. How can there be such a person in this world? Wu Daozi looked at Luo Fan's swaying figure. His mind couldn't help but have this thought. But soon, when he thought of his own situation, he thought that even when faced with this kind of person who provoked him without any scruples, a cultivator whose cultivation level was much lower than his, he actually could not think of anything other than enduring and even creating convenience for him. He felt even more sullen. After all, Wu Daozi was already a peak quasi-sage. This kind of grievance did not linger in his heart for too long. Very soon, he completely suppressed it and his state of mind returned to being as calm as an ancient well. With a turn of his eyes, he noticed the ruins of a cave in the distance. He noticed the Chuan Zong Taoist sitting cross-legged next to the ruins. His eyes flashed with satisfaction. I hope the cultivators who cross the path will be as obedient as him. That way my mission will be much easier. Wu Daozi thought with hope in his eyes. At this moment, the Chuan Zong Taoist was still sitting cross-legged like he was a few days ago. His body was surging with power and his aura was very lively. He was faintly moving towards an unimaginable level. But for Wu Daozi and Luo Fan, it was just an ordinary increase in cultivation. Everything that happened on the Qilin Cliff over the past few days didn't exist for him. It could even be said that the Qilin Cliff and himself didn't seem to exist for the past few days. For him, they existed. Only the chaotic information from the battle between Master Ashen Wood and Wu Daozi a few days ago, and the profound mysteries still existed. The rise of his aura and the increase of his cultivation was due to this information and these mysteries. This information was very profound and mysterious. It even contained many secrets of peak quasi-sages. As long as he could gain something from it, it would be a great opportunity for the Chuan Zong Taoist. It would be very beneficial to his cultivation. These days, he had been searching for the principles and secrets of the pinnacle of sage to be, his cultivation, his improvement and his changes. Obviously, he had gained a lot and was gradually transforming it into his own cultivation. Wu Daozi glanced at the Chuan Zong Taoist, then turned around and raised his hand. Whether it was the Enlightenment Cottage or the Enlightenment Praying Mat, they all disappeared without a trace as if they had never been there. Then, he took a step forward and returned to the edge of the Qilin Cliff. He sat down cross-legged and faced the 150 million epical vortexes in the sea of clouds to continue waiting. As for the Chuan Zong Taoist, he had already forgotten about it. The changes that happened to the Chuan Zong Taoist were no secret to Wu Daozi. He could see clearly with one glance and knew the secret. He also knew that the Chuan Zong Taoist had benefited from the battle between him and Ashen Musi. However, this was nothing to him. Even if he absorbed everything, he would only be inferior to Luo Fan. As a result, why would he care about the Chuan Zong Taoist? Even if he hoped that the later generations would all be like the Chuan Zong Taoist, it would still be the same. The winner was the king and the weak were the bandits. This principle had already been revealed from this point. The ancestral Taoist was an existence that Wu Daozi welcomed, but because he was too weak, in Wu Daozi's heart, he was far less important than Luo Fan, who he disliked. Luo Fan was inside the last day's palace. At this moment, he was sitting cross-legged in a sea of clouds. He raised his hand and a mysterious aura appeared before him. This strand of aura was only the size of a strand of hair, but it was all the aura he had managed to extract from the aura that the enlightenment futon had sent into his body over the past few days. The moment this aura appeared in the sea of clouds, the entire sea of clouds changed. It seemed like it was gradually changing into the shape of a praying mat. However, it seemed that the factors that caused the change were not enough, so the change was not completely formed. The transformed praying mat was very blurry and abstract. Unless one had a preconceived idea, it would be very difficult to tell that it was a praying mat. Facing such a praying mat, a faint smile appeared on Luofan's face. As expected, this aura is the essence of the enlightenment praying mat. This thought flashed through his mind. The surrounding sea of clouds was actually evolved from the 3D talisman. It looked like the boundless sea of clouds under Chelan Cliff in the outside world. In fact, its essence was the power of the 3D talisman. Because of this, the changes in the sea of clouds were easily affected by the aura in the 3D talisman. Because of this, the changes in the sea of clouds were easily affected by the aura in the 3D talisman. At this moment, the reason why it had changed into the shape of this abstract praying mat was because of the small strand of aura that Luofan had cut off from the enlightenment praying mat's aura. The shape of this praying mat was actually the most fundamental shape of the enlightenment praying mat, or rather, the most basic shape. With Luofan's perception, it was not easy to sense the aura of the enlightenment praying mat. That aura seemed to be just an ordinary aura, but its internal structure was exquisite and complicated. It had reached a level that even Luofan could not imagine. No matter how much he raised the sensitivity of his perception, even if he could magnify the aura by 1,000,000,000 times, what he could see was still a dense and complex structure that could not be analyzed. This structure was constructed from countless strange runes. These runes were fine and dense, and each rune seemed to be constructed from countless other runes. Even the countless runes that made up these runes seemed to be made up of countless runes as well, and so on, one ring after another, as if there was no end to it. This feeling was similar to the structure of Luofan's layered 3D talisman, but this rune structure was more thorough. The structure of Luofan's layered 3D talisman was still traceable. One could find out where the layers were, and analyze how many 3D talisman layers were constructed from, and what kind of power and substance was the foundation of this 3D talisman. The structure of the runes seemed to be endless, one ring after another, layer after layer, without a beginning or an end. Without a beginning and without an end, it was impossible to analyze how many layers there were, and it was even more impossible to see how the materials used to construct these runes were constructed. However, such a structure did not really have countless layers, and it was not that the number of layers and the degree of subtlety exceeded the limits of Luofan's perception. In fact, the number of rings of these runes was much less than what Luofan had seen. The structure of these runes was like a strange Mobius ring, forming a very unbelievable structure. It seemed to be composed of innumerable layers of runes, and the basic unit rune of each layer was also composed of innumerable runes. But in fact, after going deeper into the layers, the innumerable runes that formed the most basic runes were unbelievably the largest runes. Or rather, it could not be said to be the largest runes. Instead, it was the runes on the upper runes that were the easiest to spot at a glance. In this way, it formed a strange structure that was close to an infinite loop. This kind of structure was not simply linked together. Instead, according to some kind of law that could not be described with words, the relationship between them underwent some kind of extremely complicated exchange. Finally, after going through various changes that surpassed the limits of Luofan's understanding, it formed this seemingly endless and wondrous structure in front of him. The instant Luofan distinguished this structure, he suddenly felt that the wisp of aura was expanding wildly. In the blink of an eye, it filled the heaven and earth, and covered everything that he could see. He seemed to have fallen into the world of aura in that instant. Or to be more precise, he seemed to have entered the world of the strange rune structure in that instant. His entire world, everything that he sensed, and everything that he saw were all runes. There were countless, mysterious, yet unimaginably complex and indescribably mysterious runes. These runes floated in the void, and all of them were octagonal and hung down. There seemed to be some kind of mysterious connection between them that strung them together. If one locked onto a rune floating in the void and observed it closely, one would find that there were countless octagonal runes hanging down. He magnified his senses, and looked at these floating runes from a macroscopic perspective. There were countless runes densely packed together, and one would discover that these runes formed an even larger rune. Zooming in on the macroscopic perspective, the larger runes were countless runes that formed a rune. In this way, be it macroscopic or microscopic, it was an endless structure. So that's how it is. As Luo Fan sensed all of this, an indescribable shock flashed through his mind. Such a structure. It was a structure that he had never thought of. The mystery contained in it was profound and unfathomable. He even dared not believe that this structure could be created by a peak sage to be. This is definitely the means of a sage. Only the means of a sage can achieve such an incredible feat. Such a delicate and mysterious structure, if I can comprehend it, it will definitely be of great benefit to my cultivation. Maybe it can directly help me break through the transcendent realm and become a Tao master. A shocking thought overwhelmed Luo Fan, and the expression on his face changed uncontrollably. This layered rune structure was similar to the three-dimensional rune structure of Luo Fan's layered talisman. At least, it was similar in the idea. However, what Luo Fan did was limited to the surface. It was limited to the accumulation of layers, while the structure of this rune had gone beyond the surface and the accumulation of layers. It had reached a higher level, even beyond the space-time structure. And the structure of this rune was obviously the next step of this idea. If Luo Fan could fully understand this structure, then he would naturally be able to build the structure of his layered three-dimensional talisman in the same way. Through the various changes, he could more clearly understand the mystery of the three-dimensional talisman and the mystery of his own worldview, so that his cultivation realm could be improved and even achieved a breakthrough. At this moment, Luo Fan's position was actually in that wisp of aura, because he understood the structure of the rune in that aura. So it triggered the response of that aura, and naturally pulled him into that endless structure. The principle of such a thing was actually not difficult to understand. Although that aura was small, the rune structure in it was endless. The outermost rune could be regarded as a unit of the smallest rune. In this way it was obvious. The entire world could naturally be seen as an extremely tiny part of this aura. The tiny units that made up the smallest runes were the runes that were exposed to the outside world. The world where the runes were exposed to the outside world could also be seen as part of the aura. The void where the tiny runes were located could also be seen as a part of the aura. This statement was absolutely contradictory to ordinary people and even ordinary cultivators. It was absolutely impossible. Therefore, to ordinary people and even ordinary cultivators, this aura was a tiny strand of aura the size of a strand of hair. However, for a cultivator who knew about the structure of the aura, since he admitted the existence of the inconceivable structure of the rune, it was equivalent to admitting the result of the deduction brought about by the structure. He admitted that the world was only an extremely small part of the rune. And for cultivators, this kind of admission was already enough. It was enough to pull cultivators into this rune structure and step into that ridiculous rune structure that had no beginning and end, unable to escape. In other words, at this moment, Luo Fan could be said to be lost in this rune structure. As long as he did not understand the mysteries of this structure, as long as he did not understand why the surface structure could become the unit of the inner structure, he would not be able to escape this state and return to the outside of this aura. This was a fact that Luo Fan had already confirmed after drilling up and down a few times. If ordinary people encountered such a situation, even if this place contained unfathomable mysteries and secrets that could make any cultivator go crazy, they would definitely be extremely shocked. But for Luo Fan, there was no such shock at all. At this moment, there was not even a trace of panic in his heart. The reason for this was very simple. It was because this place, this world before it broke into the Earth universe, and even the Dharma ending age, for Luo Fan, was only a stop on his path of cultivation. There was no special meaning to it at all. In contrast, the place he was currently in, the inside of this aura, and the structure of the rune was no different from the outside world or the Dharma ending age that would happen billions of years later. To him, staying in the Dharma ending era was cultivation. To him, staying in the gap between heaven and earth and the primal chaos was also cultivation. To him, staying in the world before it shattered and became the earth and the universe was also cultivation. To him, staying here was even more cultivation. Chapter 10:19. When Luo Fan appeared in the strange void and saw a huge rune in front of him, Luo Fan's figure instantly disappeared from the three-dimensional seal. Only a strand of strange, hair-sized strand of hope was left floating in the entire three-dimensional seal. At the same time, the three-dimensional seal also underwent some extremely subtle changes along with Luo Fan's disappearance. Suddenly, it seemed to have turned into nothingness, and the originally incomparably solid sense of existence disappeared without a trace in an instant. It was as if the three-dimensional seal, named the Last Days Palace, had suddenly turned into an illusory shadow, as if it had no substance at all. This change instantly attracted Wu Daozi's attention. At this moment, Wu Daozi was sitting cross-legged on the edge of Qilin Cliff, looking down at the more than 150 million era vortexes. He was comprehending the mysteries within while waiting for the cultivator who could pass through the era vortex and come to this point in time. Suddenly, a change occurred somewhere on Qilin Cliff. This change was extremely subtle. In a trance, even Wu Daozi himself couldn't find out what the change was, and he couldn't understand the mystery behind it. However, Wu Daozi was the master of Qilin Cliff, the master of this training ground. After all, he had cultivated here for hundreds of millions of years, and he had long become one with Qilin Cliff. After a slight sensing, he found the source of this change. "What's going on? What did you do this time?" Sensing the source of the change, he couldn't help but be angry. He stood up and took a step forward, arriving at the Last Days Palace, which was in front of the 11-layer three-dimensional seal. At this moment, the three-dimensional talisman didn't look any different from before, but the aura within it had completely changed. The feeling that it originally existed was incomparably real, as if it was a real object. The feeling of a real palace had completely disappeared. At first glance, this palace was like an incomparably real illusory shadow. What's going on? Wu Daozi's mind was filled with doubts. This change had happened on Qilin Cliff. Originally, no matter how complicated the principle was, he should have been able to find some traces. Even if he couldn't understand the details, he certainly wouldn't have been unaware. But at this moment, faced with the strange changes in the Last Days Palace, Yi Zichen's heart sank. He just couldn't understand it. He felt at a loss. If something like this happened in the dojo of his master, the ancestor of all demons, he would naturally feel that it was only natural. He wouldn't feel anything else. However, all of this had happened here, in the Qilin Cliff, the place where he had lived for hundreds of millions of years. To him, it was as if a part of his body had suddenly become extremely unfamiliar, and he had suddenly lost all sense of it. It was easy to imagine how uncomfortable that feeling was. No matter how strong you are, your cultivation realm is only at the great accomplishment of sage to be. How could I not notice the things you have done? Wu Daozi frowned and thought to himself. With that thought in mind, he opened his right hand and began to perform a dazzling series of hand seals. This was a divination magic that he had inherited from a sage. It allowed him to spend a large amount of energy to divine what he wanted to divine, including everything in the past, present, and future. Of course, although the spell itself had the ability to calculate everything, the effect of this ability could only be exerted by the cultivator using the spell. For a peak sage to be like Wu Daozi, the past, present, and future of hundreds of millions of years were nothing to him. As long as he was willing to spend energy, he could divine it. However, past and future beyond this period of time was an impossible task for him. Calculating beyond this period of time was enough to exhaust all of his strength, and even his life might be completely exhausted by this kind of consumption. Wu Daozi was originally full of confidence. He thought that when he used his divination magic, all the secrets of what was happening before him would appear in front of him without any concealment. Therefore, when he first started, he was very careless. However, as he continued his divination, his face became uglier and the energy in his body became more and more serious. The movements of his right hand also became faster and faster. In the end, it turned into a large shadow. Every movement seemed to have surpassed the speed of light. The surrounding spacetime even produced a mysterious fluctuation due to this movement, forming circles and circles of mysterious ripples that spread in all directions. This divination obviously contained some kind of profound mystery. The ripples produced by this divination movement also carried a trace of mystery. As the ripples spread, there were all kinds of indescribable changes. As the ripples rotated in the void, they even vaguely formed a strange three-dimensional 8 trigrams. 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 10,000,000 years, 100,000,000 years. The time that Wu Daozi calculated grew longer and longer, from a few days to 10 years, and then it continued to grow until it reached 100,000,000 years. In the end, what he saw was exactly the same as what he saw in front of him. The last day's palace was still the same as it was now, and there seemed to be no change at all. At first glance, it also seemed so real, but with a slight feeling, it was only an illusion, and there was no substance at all. If it was only for the next 10 years, 100 years, or even 100,000,000 years, then Wu Daozi could face it calmly. He believed that Luo Fan hadn't changed his way of doing things and hadn't restored the so-called last day's palace. However, this time period was not just the future. It included the past, the present, and the future. In other words, not only would the last day's palace exist in such a strange form in the long future, but it would also be the same in the long past that he had divined. There was no other form at all. How is this possible? Could it be that my memories of the past 200 years were all fake? In the past 200 years, this person clearly appeared in front of me, and this palace was clearly real. It did not look like this. In an instant, Wu Daozi almost broke out in a cold sweat. He could not help but think this way. This divination divine ability had endless power, and its effect was unimaginably powerful. The past, present, and future that he divined were all completely real. He had enough experience to prove this point in the hundreds of billions of years since he had been taught this divine ability. He did not know how many times he had divined the past and the future with this divine ability. They had all appeared in the end without any surprises. No matter how subtle or sensitive the variable was, it was not different from the result of the calculation. This was the source of his confidence. However, at this moment, this was the result of the divination divine ability. It was clearly completely different from his memories. How could he not have such a thought when the things he had experienced before were completely different from what he had predicted? After all, Wu Daozi was a disciple of a sage, and his Taoist heart was firm. After suspecting whether his memories were fake, he no longer had any intention of divining what was happening in front of him. Instead, he sat down cross-legged in front of the last day's palace and did not care about anything else. He did not even care about the more than 150 million error vortexes. He started to comprehend his memories bit by bit, starting from his earliest memories. He trusted the divination divine ability passed down by the sage, the ancestor of all demons. He did not doubt that the result of the divination would be wrong. Therefore, when the result did not match his memories, the first thing he thought was that there was a problem with his memories. Obviously, compared to the problem with his memories, everything in front of him, whether it was the changes that happened in Luo Fan's last day's palace or the possible changes that might happen in the era vortexes, was insignificant. After all, if his memories were fake, would he still be himself? Since he was no longer himself, what was the point of becoming a sage? What was the point of the plan? The time that Wu Daozi had experienced was extremely long. It was difficult to describe the time that he had experienced even if it was calculated in trillions of years. It was easy to imagine how many memories he had accumulated over such a long period of time. If he wanted to go through his memories from the beginning and search for the false and untrue parts of his memories, the amount of time he needed would obviously not be too short. As a result, as the years passed, Wu Daozi's figure remained the same as before. He sat cross-legged in front of the last day's palace with his eyes closed. He went through his memories bit by bit and comprehended everything he had experienced in the trillions of years since he was born. He recalled every single thing he had experienced and every bit of his mental journey. This was an extremely huge project. If it was an ordinary person, it would be an impossible task for them to rearrange everything that they had experienced in the past week and go through it in their mind. However, Wu Daozi did not have to do it in a week, a month, a year, or even tens of thousands of years. It was a long period of time that could be calculated in trillions. It was easy to imagine how difficult it was. Time slowly passed, and in the blink of an eye, it had been 10,000 years. During these 10,000 years, Wu Daozi had been sitting in the lotus position with his eyes closed as he went through his memories. The three-dimensional talisman called the Last Day's Palace in front of him had not changed at all. Even after 10,000 years, it was still the same as it was 10,000 years ago. There was not the slightest difference. During these 10,000 years, there had been a third cultivator on Qilin Cliff, other than Wu Daozi and Luo Fan. The sect legacy Taoist was not the same as them, but had undergone a heaven-shaking, earth-toppling change. More than 1,000 years after Wu Daozi cut himself off from the outside world, he had made a breakthrough in his cultivation. By completely absorbing the mysteries of the battle between Wu Daozi and Master Ashenwood, he pushed his cultivation from the late completion quasi-saint realm to the peak of the late completion quasi-saint realm. Such a realm, just in terms of cultivation realm, compared to the end of Luo Fan's transcendent realm, it was only one level lower. Of course, this was only in terms of cultivation level. Regardless of the cultivation method, it was still the same. Whether it was true strength or even true cultivation realm, he and Luo Fan were tens of thousands of times apart. This gap was enough for Luo Fan to easily crush him. He didn't even need to make a move. Just a gentle pressure of his aura would be enough to crush him into powder. When the ancestral patriarch came back to his senses, he found that the Qilin Cliff was completely different from before he started cultivating. Other than the ruins not far from him, everything was the same as when he first came to the Qilin Cliff. It was as if time had returned to that time. Such a change. It made him feel a bit dazed. However, the change in his cultivation allowed him to clearly know that time did not flow backward. He understood that he had obtained unimaginable benefits on the Qilin Cliff. At this moment, he even felt an indescribable sense of gratitude towards Wu Daozi. It was the respect towards the disciples of the saint. It turned into respect towards Wu Daozi himself. Under these circumstances, for the next few thousand years, he took the initiative to do what Wu Daozi had done. He sat at the edge of the Qilin Cliff and waited for the ones that might appear from the 150 million era vortexes. The living beings who had walked that path and passed through 9,999 checkpoints. He didn't know if he was lucky or unlucky, but over the past 8,000 years, there were 8 batches of beings that charged out from the 150 million era vortexes. The reason why he used 8 batches instead of 8 was simple. It was the beings that charged out from the era vortexes. Not every era vortex only had one cultivator. Among them, there were 6 cultivators who rushed out of the time vortexes. There were more than one cultivator, and the largest number even reached more than 30. To these cultivators who rushed out of the time whirlpool and came to Qilin Cliff, sect Chuan Daoist put on airs and treated them like how Wu Daozi treated him. In the eyes of Wu Daozi, Luo Fan, Ashen Muzi, and Rain Shensi, the ancestral patriarch's strength was insignificant. They didn't even need to make a move, they could just use their aura to wipe them out. However, as a peak great accomplishment quasi-sage realm cultivator, his strength was still extremely strong compared to ordinary cultivators. Although each of these 8 batches of cultivators was a great perfection quasi-sage, the strongest among them was only a minor perfection quasi-sage. They were still 2 small realms away from the great perfection and pinnacle realm of ancestral patriarch. This gap was so huge that it couldn't be closed with numbers. In other words, to the patriarch, the number of cultivators was meaningless. There was no difference between 1 and 10 million, unless they could use some method to condense and sublimate the power of the whole body. Therefore, to them, the patriarch was like Wu Daozi was to the patriarch. They both had a crushing advantage, enough to suppress the cultivators who had rushed out of the vortex of time in the past several thousand years. In this way, the result was obvious. Although these cultivators weren't completely convinced like the ancestral patriarch, they still obediently found a place on Qilin Cliff to set up a cave. They didn't dare to leave Qilin Cliff. Due to the hard work of the patriarch Chuan, the number of cultivators in Qilin Cliff was no longer the original 3. Instead, it had expanded to 96. Every time he saw that the number of cultivators in Qilin Cliff had increased, the ancestral patriarch couldn't help but feel proud. I wonder how the disciples of the sages will praise me when they wake up. Every time he thought of this, he looked forward to it. If Luo Fan knew what the ancestral patriarch was thinking, he would be extremely disdainful. One day, while the ancestral patriarch was waiting for another cultivator to pass the 9,999 checkpoints, there was a sudden strong wave that swept through the entire Qilin Cliff and even the surrounding sea of clouds. This wave was the wave of an aura. The aura that caused this fluctuation was so vast that it was unimaginable. The patriarch Chuan even felt a sense of suffocation. The complacency that he had accumulated over thousands of years because of the many things he had done was instantly destroyed by this aura. Of course, although he was satisfied with his success, there was still a sense of anticipation in his heart. This was because he could already sense that the aura that caused this wave was an aura that he was extremely familiar with. This aura was the aura that he had been looking forward to for thousands of years. It was the aura of Wu Daozi. Obviously, the appearance of this aura meant that Wu Daozi had changed. Judging from Wu Daozi's current state, this change was most likely because he had woken up from that extremely strange state. The truth was just as the ancestral patriarch had expected. Wu Daozi, who was in front of the last day's palace, had already opened his eyes and his aura had started to increase endlessly. Wu Daozi was a peak quasi-sage. His aura was extremely powerful and mysterious, and he could even condense all kinds of strange creatures to fight against his enemies. If he wanted to, all the living beings on Qilin Cliff would be wiped out because of his limitless raising of his aura. However, Wu Daozi did not have such thoughts of wiping out all life. As a result, even though his aura rose, it did not change into the shape of a strange beast. Instead, it was like flowing water. It simply filled the world and declared his existence to the world.